After the Sons of Liberty, Metal Gear Solid took a step forward by looking back. Its web of themes would be traced to their origin point in an act of culmination but also simplification, by having Metal Gear Solid 3 focus on the origins of Big Boss, the main villain of Metal Gear 1 and 2, and whose legacy lived on through Solid, Liquid and Solidus Snake in the preceding titles, which you can learn all about in my videos on those other games, by the way. Originally conceived as a PS3 game, development quickly shifted instead to the PS2, though from reading about the process, MGS3 didn't appear to suffer quite the same intense dev cycle as its predecessor, save for some trouble they had constructing jungle environments for gameplay, so not only was the story being pared down in scope, the hardware employed would remain the same. This focus, and relative to MGS2, lesser ambition, slots in with Kojima writing what he knows a bit more this time around. He was abandoning the speculative near/alternative future of Metal Gear Solid 1 and 2 along with its postmodern exploration of identity, control and agency. The focus wasn't going to be gene or meme, but scene. He'd be exploring how shifting cultures and societies shape people, how they react and the systemic motivations for these changes. And the time he'd be planting this exploration in was that of his own childhood, the 1960s. Kojima likes to say he's 70% movies, and Metal Gear Solid 3 is where that feels most true. Not because the game is any more cinematic than earlier titles, but because it's more unabashedly referential and derivative of the stories he was absorbing growing up. MGS3 is aware of its own place, at the end of a trilogy and expected to do a fair amount of explaining, while at the same time not dealing with the baggage of MGS2 by promising to follow up directly on it. Perhaps this knowledge that Snake Eater was an ending of sorts was what conjured up some more personal sentimentality from Kojima, allowing him to reflect how his craft and the industry around it had changed him by looking back upon not just the things he'd created, but the experiences that informed them. Regardless of the motivation, it paid off. The fanfare around MGS3 was a little more muted than that of Sons of Liberty. It wasn't some generational leap, and plenty of people felt burned by the reveal of Raiden, so the sales numbers didn't quite soar as high as before. But the critical reception certainly did, and in the time since, Snake Eater has supplanted itself as probably the most evergreen entry in the series. It's restrained, expressive, charmingly retro, but not obsolete, and refreshingly self-contained, while not sacrificing the narrative stylings that Metal Gear Solid is so known for. It's just about the easiest recommendation you can give for a newcomer to these batshit games, so let's find out why. The title screen gives a fair amount of the game away, or at least suggests towards it. The setting is communicated via the music, which is similarly tense and precise as that of MGS 1 and 2, but this time with more wooden percussion and dashes of flute to let us know we'll be in amongst nature. This is furthered by the subject of the frame, that being Snake engaging with an enemy via CQC, or close quarters combat. This demonstrates the mechanical growth but temporal regression, as there's an emphasis here on touch, less on technology. Carrying on the gameplay hints is the ability to change the camouflage patterns and colour in the background, referencing the camo index you'll engage with during gameplay, but also the idea of scene, of times changing and the attitudinal shifts that accompany that progression. Finally, giving this semblance of control to the player is representative of the subject of control within the story. Solid Snake and Raiden were used as pawns to show us just how minutely systems can program or control us. This time around, there's a degree of freedom being given by way of the changing colours and patterns, but that freedom is exercised within a pre-existing framework, and this angle is more appropriate for Snake Eater's thematic exploration. Metal Gear Solid 3 continues to assert its simpler approach by some positively pared back briefing materials. In contrast to MGS1's detailed and numerous videos and 2's pages-long in-universe accounts, we have just 2 videos, each one being a slightly lengthened briefing sequence for the 2 missions. You can already see the lack of baggage paying some dividends here.
After the end of World War II, the world was split into 2, East and West.
Starting up the game, Snake establishes that we're focusing on the Cold War. The mission at hand involves rescuing Sokolov, a rocket and weapons scientist who'd previously defected from the USSR. Despite the official story, the US was able to get the Soviets to remove nukes from Cuba during the missile crisis by giving Sokolov back to them. He's since been put to work on a new nuclear device, hence the US wanting to hold its development by saving him. With Sokolov temporarily at an outpost near a testing ground for the weapon, now's the chance to get him back. Before the briefing goes down, however, we get a peek at Snake. First we get a few establishing shots of the plane as it soars through the sky, nearing Soviet airspace. This is an allusion to the beginning shots of MGS1, which focus on the mission control submarine. There's a visual legacy being invoked here which helps assure players that this is still the series you love, just reconfigured slightly for a different time. Snake is first focused on via a close-up on his cigar as another passenger bugs him to start getting ready. This iteration of the character is still framed as cool and a bit of a renegade, at least in terms of attitude, but he's also questioned by the aforementioned passenger. Naked Snake isn't infallible or a legend yet. He hasn't quite earned the true gassing up that Solid Snake gets in Sons of Liberty's introduction. The plane's interior is shot quiet and steady, creating contrast with the visual of the plane cutting through the sky, wind whipping past at incredible speeds. The environment's character is also being set up here, making sure that we understand that it will serve as just as much an obstacle as the guards and the soldiers themselves. The interior and exterior finally intersect as the bay doors are opened. Snake will be performing the world's first halo jump. Sunrise floods the plane, dawn is breaking on a new legend. Snake jumps at last, and this is where we get the briefing that elucidates the objectives in place. We then cut back to the jump, where as Snake lands, we're treated to more references to previous games. Building on Naked Snake's naked status, his landing is nowhere near as smooth as Solid Snake's is onto the tanker in MGS2, as he loses some gear along the way. This shot of Naked Snake is dramatic, no doubt, but way less explosive. There's no arcing electricity to reveal him as rain pelts down, just the chirps of the jungle and forested vista that stretches out in front of you. We then have the now standard mask reveal moment, where we see his face entrenched in the mission's environment for the first time. This intro does a great job of stratifying and defining Metal Gear Solid 3's identity in relation to the rest of the series. It keeps character dynamics relatively consistent, only defying them to establish how this Snake differs from others, and instead emphasizes the differences present amongst contextual elements. We drop into clear sunny weather instead of torrential rain. The vehicle in the beginning is a plane instead of a submarine. The technology being utilized and its novelty for the time is highlighted rather than presumed standard as it is in MGS1. Snake Eater is a lot keener to keep us in the know, actively telling us that what happened in MGS2 isn't the case here. Having landed on safe ground, Snake receives his codename of Naked Snake from Major Zero and then heads off to retrieve his backpack, having got snagged on a branch during his landing. Each of the Solid games has one simple objective to get you accustomed to the game's controls and style of design before amping things up. In Metal Gear Solid 1, this is getting to the elevator, and in Sons of Liberty, it's exploring the deck of the ship and heading inside. Grabbing your backpack is serving the same fundamental process here in MGS3, but the major departure is in the space you navigate to accomplish that goal. There are no guards, nothing that can really hurt you, and so the focus is put on the environment itself and the animal inhabitants. That's the thing Snake Eater wants you to get used to. It accomplishes this ambiently. You observe that there's two primary paths, one in front of you where you can crawl under a log, and another to the right which takes you to an upper ridge. Then there's a small alcove to the left which has a fallen log you can climb over, and past that a couple snakes and mushrooms to collect. It's passively reintroducing you to MGS2's new movement options, helping you understand how they apply in a more fluid ecosystem. No matter what path you take though, you will inevitably scope out the camo index in the top right as the number dials up or down depending on the terrain, and also the stamina bar which juts out past your life bar. That one won't be quite so easy to figure out, but it at least makes itself known so that you can keep an eye on it. Not only does this little area do a great job of inculcating gameplay's core ideas, it also shows the control over emphasis it has. The jungle is predictably a compilation of brown and green shades with a pretty heavy yellowish green tint to the whole environment, which could make for a redundant, muddled image, but the game uses its geometry and lighting to help you understand the main subjects of each area, in this case the tree from which the backpack hangs, with shafts of light beaming down on it, and having been placed in the center of a small clearing. Having got the backpack, things become a bit more familiar. Major gives you a call to stress the importance of stealth and additionally survival, giving a bit more detail on those mechanics. You're also introduced to Paramedic, who can give you information on flora and fauna you come across, and is who you call to save the game. The last person you chat to is the boss, Snake's former mentor and advisor to the mission. This is where things get more complicated, as the dynamic feels quite unique within the series. She's an authority over Snake that's never once undercut by his sarcasm or quips. She's an insight into how this Snake became who he is and by extension, who he will be. She speaks definitively and he doesn't question that. When he does, it's not with an assertiveness, it's sort of trepidatious and curious. She's also the first to invoke the times as a term, explaining how politics and the political situation of the moment determine an enemy, and how a soldier should follow that regardless of their personal inclination. That's what defines the difference between a fighter and a soldier. She emphasizes the importance of having loyalty to the mission and its objectives. Those are the things that the times have carved out for him at the moment, and that should be what drives him forward. This whole conversation does a great job of demystifying Snake and showing him as someone who's still being molded. There's elasticity to his character and disposition, which plays into the inherent intrigue around how he becomes Big Boss. With the reunion complete and your gear back on your hip, it's time to head to the factory Sokolov's held up in. This is when gameplay becomes more fully formed within the experience. The general routine remains the same: observe guard layouts and patterns, sneak past or eliminate them while exploring the area for additional items, and ultimately move forward towards the larger objective. Keeping on trend with the series' progression, MGS3 has more detailed guard interaction, stealth tools, and weapons at your disposal. But before we get into all of those, it's worth highlighting the vector through which you interface with them, the controls. This is a pretty touchy subject around this game, I'd say. Some people love them, others hate them. Plainly put, they're cumbersome, but to me they're also perfect. They work in tandem with the level design expertly, but you do need to take some time to acclimatize yourself. The controls aren't even really that different than MGS2, it's just that the surrounding space has changed and the interactions possible have become more numerous, complicated, and specific. It means that you need to take advantage of all the little control nuances that exist for optimal play, which in turn adds to the learning curve. A prime example of how that learning curve plays out is shooting someone in first person. To enter first person, you press the right bumper. To raise your weapon ready to fire, you can either click in the left stick or press and hold X. You still use the right stick to move the camera. You can also use the left or right triggers to lean either way, or use both simultaneously to raise your height slightly. Mind you, this takes advantage of analog triggers, so there's many degrees of a trigger pull that the game registers and accounts for in the leaning. So taken all in all, the act of entering first person and shooting an enemy can require the use of up to 6 different parts of the controller and the engagement of 5 different fingers simultaneously, which is pretty absurd on its face. Plenty of games will have you scrambling all over the controller, but rarely at the same time like this. And this isn't an exceptional example, it's common to take out guards this way. So you can see how daunting this can be, especially when they're on patrols and so are not lingering in the same spot for too long. There's often a time constraint on getting your shot off, and missing could mean raising suspicion and causing someone to investigate, thereby abandoning their usual routine and requiring you to adjust to a new paradigm for the particular area. So an obvious common interaction has the potential to be incredibly complicated and consequential for your performance. That's how things start off, overwhelming and frankly hard to get your head around. But with time and a few points of failure, you'll begin to see why this specificity is so crucial. It's giving you power and options over how you interact. There's micro decisions being made constantly. What starts as slowly lining up your shot only to miss the opportunity and so waiting patiently for it to present itself again, morphs into a deft, decision-rich string of button presses and holds. You spot a guard in the distance and what direction he's walking in. You press and hold to do a roll into a patch of grass that, thanks to the button hold, immediately puts you in prone for the best camera rating you can get. You then quickly enter first person, pull down the triggers to raise out of the grass, click left stick to get your iron sights up, aim slightly ahead of his dome, and watch as he walks right between the sights so you can press X, take your shot and have him knocked out. This belabored 6-button affair that I described before has now been honed into a slick 4-second process that feels amazing to pull off, which is why the controls are so fantastic. Their breadth, in time, becomes an essential asset that empowers the player and rewards investment into them. These types of routines and tricks to best getting by unseen crop up in unique ways depending on the environment you're in, the tools you have equipped, and even the plants and animals that surround you. The steep controls learning curve is softened somewhat thanks to the considerate level design in these first few areas. The first one is a little swamp littered with alligators where only the perimeter and a tiny island in the middle remain safe. It's a rather antagonistic start, but one that stops you in your tracks and forces you to look around a bit and consider the space. This will help you understand that enemies come in the form of not just people but also animals, and that it's worth looking around as you'll likely spot a few items to your left. This gives way to the game's first true encounter. The space provides you with a pretty long lead in to any actual danger, with a single soldier ambling towards you. Ample grass is on each of your flanks, and there's a hollowed out log with an item inside for even more surefire cover. Moving forward, you come to an impasse. Continuing onward takes you into a small clearing with a guard roughly scouting its perimeter. While it's bereft of grass, making it easier to feel out in the weeds with little cover, stumps with raised ridges on one side can be hidden in. If you go the other way, you find yourself in a similar situation, this time with a slightly less circular piece of land but more grass. The two paths meet again at the area's exit where a final enemy will be found patrolling. The design here reinforces the lessons learned with the alligators while planting it in more consequential circumstances. The guards are placed in such a way that they only briefly overlap in each of their respective orbits. Making a mistake is likely to only tip off one, or if you're unlucky, 2 guards at a time. But they'll only be in full alert if once they come looking they find you, so you're given a chance to sort things out if you do slip up. There's also strong emphasis on how a space loosens and tightens up as needed. The open area at the start lets you hide if you don't notice the guard walking towards you right away, so you can easily arc around him as he searches. Things then narrow in as you come to a decision point as to which path to take. The ridges that surround you actually take pressure off, as they make you confident that what you see ahead is what you can expect to find. You're not worried about being caught out by something you can't spot from your current position. Then, as you need to engage with an enemy again, things ease back out to give you more breathing room for the oncoming confrontation, or ideally lack thereof. The final challenge comes at the exit, where the lines of sight intersect, making for more precipitous sneaking and the need for good timing. It's a tiny test that, if failed, is not too heavily punished, as the next location has a cutscene which will reset any alert status. The final thing that this area uses its design to do is change up the texture and terrain you're traversing. The shifting density of grass and transitions from green jungle floor to muddy clearing and even patches of orange/red leaves means that the camo index will be in flux to some extent no matter what path you take, so it kind of forces you to interface with it. Some people find it a rather shallow and transparent system that can impede on play too much, which is a perspective with merit. There's no real strategy to applying camouflage. It's a simple game of observing the number in the top right and then choosing whichever option the menu tells you is best. So you're not really making a meaningful player-led decision, you're just doing something the game's telling you to do. It's more a checkbox than a mechanic. But fuck it, I like it anyway. And there's myriad reasons why, so I'm just going to list some of them now rather than bury the lead too much. One, I just like that you can change Snake's clothes. I'm someone who really likes character customization, and so it's fun to get an opportunity to change up the colour scheme now and then. Also, if you've played enough, you know where cutscenes are, so you can just choose the dumbest thing possible for Snake to wear during some rather serious conversations. But on to the actual gameplay reasons. I do think it helps you build good habits. The camo index encourages you to consider where you are and where you will be. It helps you build your observational skills and adds points of contact to a plan. You don't just think, okay, I'll head that way until I'm up against the tree stump. Instead you think, I'll continue forward until I cross that threshold when I'll need to change my camo. Then once that's done, I'll move on to the tree stump. The latter is more detailed and considered. It'll make you a better player and as you go keeps you honest. Failing to engage with camouflage will humble you at some point. Camo also helps define the possibilities of play within a given space. It's not as though you can always get to 100%, at which point you're basically invisible in every area of the game. In fact, I believe there's only one area where you can do that, and you need to do a very specific thing to get the camo that allows for it. But my point is that sometimes the absolute best rating you can get is like 45 or 50%, and others it's 90%. And that difference can be felt pretty drastically within gameplay. So staying in touch with the system and understanding the upper limit for your camo for a given area also gives you insight as to what you can and can't get away with in terms of your own gameplay. At 90%, fuck it, just let a guy walk right by you so you can get on your feet, sneak behind him and knock him out. But at 50%, someone coming towards you suddenly requires you to retreat, to hastily get back to the spot of safety you identified earlier, thanks to the observational skills built up by the camo index's constant insistence. So this system, often derided for its minimal impact, is actually pretty crucial to the game in my opinion. It has gameplay ramifications that aren't immediately obvious but nonetheless still present and important, which explains why it's such an area of focus right at the start of the game here. Moving into the next area, Snake Eater continues to reinforce the survival aspects. Snake spots a hornet's nest which can be shot down, forcing the guard to the nearest side of the bridge to flee and take his comrades further down the track with him. You're seeing how the active parts of this world, the plants and animals, can be used against your enemies in inventive ways. Crucially, by shooting down the hornet's nest, you get the nest as a food item to eat, and ointment for healing wounds from it as well. This nest is the perfect fulcrum to understanding how scavenging can be beneficial for a bevy of things, continuing to insight observation, improvisation, experimentation, and engagement with the space at large. The bridge here acts as not just an effective buffer between guards, so that you can indulge in some of that experimentation with a level of seclusion, but also makes the camo index redundant. It's so open and naturally narrow that you have to abandon the comfort of camouflage and think up a solution that allows you to move completely exposed for an extended amount of time. Like the two guards earlier with crossing paths, it's a subtle, naturalistically enforced test of skill. Successfully crossing the bridge, you move on to Rasvet, where Sokolov's being held. Everything you've learned seamlessly culminates here for a final test of your skills, the reward being the completion of your actual objective. There are a number of people patrolling with overlapping lines of sight peppered across a stark divide in environmental tone, from bright greens to yellows to deep browns and reds. Through exploring, you can find not just animals to eat or use as distractions, but new weapons and provisions to help you take out guards. It's a complex, interconnected ecosystem that you have to navigate through with precision, trying your hardest not to break the equilibrium, remaining considered and thoughtful amongst the rising tension. The controls and mechanics that earlier felt so arcane are coming into focus, sharpening into a blade that cuts and slices with a cold, initially barely registerable precision. You come to Sokolov's door a better player and Snake a more wizened soldier, even if only slightly. The change remains palpable. Sokolov's able to enlighten you on the internal conflict bubbling within the USSR. Although Khrushchev is pursuing a policy of coexistence with the West, Colonel Volgan of the GRU is opposing him, with recent events like the assassination of Kennedy helping him leech more supporters. Volgan wishes to seize the weapon Sokolov's been creating, moving it to the weapons facility he controls, and then using it as leverage for his ascendance to power. The introduction of Volgan via simple exposition could prove underwhelming, but I think it does a good job of building him up while also deepening our understanding of scene as a theme. We're being shown that the fluidity of conflict, moving in step with the times, is not just about the macro of global politics, but also intra-country politics. Leaving the building, this reality materializes as we see Snake at first being ambushed before Ocelot, one of the main villains from Metal Gear Solid 1 and 2, enters and takes all the opposing soldiers out, then catcalling his own Spetsnaz soldiers into the situation. But let's go back to the start of the cutscene for a sec. This scene serves as a great case study for how the camera is used in Snake Eater, as well as its use of filmic language overall. After the tension between Snake and Sokolov deflates, having realized they're not enemies, the game has to ratchet things up again. It does so by framing its shots rather close, keeping the pair as its subject so as to let us know that we're not being told something. The camera creeps along rather slowly, in time with Snake's own sneaky movements. You'll also notice that the camera has some subtle ambient movement and shake to it. The intent is to omit the artificiality of a purely digital camera and make sure we're planted in the space. When then briefly separated from Snake as we're clued into the guard's presence. As such, the mystery is read as solved. We're now waiting for just how Snake will get out of a tough spot. This little routine is then replicated. As Ocelot walks in, things are again framed restrictively. It clues us in via the spinning gun, but doesn't outright tell us who he is. His identity is finally confirmed, finding ourselves back at the earlier situation, learning something new, but not yet knowing how things will proceed. The moments taken earlier to establish how fucked Snake and Sokolov were, completely surrounded, are paid off. The pre-established enemy placement and general sense of geography mean that things can be effectively cut between rather quickly as Ocelot takes them all out. It's a short burst of relieved tension that is afforded legibility thanks to how the game has paced and structured the scene. While this all happens, we're being keyed into Ocelot's character. The focus on his boots, gloves, and general attire highlight his vanity and youth, while his casual, cocksure attitude suggests some level of naivete but also power. The pure brutality of the display lets us know that he'll do whatever's needed to accomplish his goal, even if it's against his own countrymen, which in itself highlights just how minute the fragility of the designation of enemy or ally can be. It's capped off by the final shot he takes, a rapid reconfiguration of his aim to pull off a fancy bank shot preempted by a simple smirk. He has some reason for his confidence. You immediately love to hate him, which is helpful as we're about to get exactly what we're hoping for. The stage is set once again when the Spetsnaz soldiers enter, which I just have to highlight, it's fucking brilliant that Ocelot calls them by meowing. It's worth noting how consistently comedic the scene remains between the meow and Sokolov's stealthy pantomimes and scared screams. But back to the topic at hand. We've just seen the enemy deal with this exact situation, with it being used to establish and build his character, so now it's time for the good guy to do the same thing, not only engendering us to him, but also showing how Ocelot and Snake are connected. There's an underlying layer of payoff to this whole thing that exists thanks to the continuity at play. We want to see how this relationship builds as we know who these people will be in the future. Ocelot tries to get the first shot off, but it jams, and then shit kicks off. The smirk by Snake is so crucial to understanding him, as it's his instinct and observation paying off. He loves that he was right and that he can leverage this tiny mistake to flip the situation back in his favour. It creates a connection between him as a character and how we play as him within gameplay. Snake slams Ocelot into the ground, disarming him. As the other Spetsnaz soldiers advance, a timeline is drawn out as Ocelot crawls for his gun again. We know Snake only has so long to take care of things. This aspect of time is compounded upon by the use of the trank gun. The game's mechanics, in this case the time it takes for a trank to work being based on where someone was shot, is being implemented into the more passive aspects of the game again, to strengthen connections and character. This fight is much more kinetic, relying on a dynamic sense of space thanks to its close quarters focus. It's a step up in action, but not a sudden one. There's been a steady ramping of stakes, danger and intensity this whole time, naturally culminating here. Snake's mastery, cheekiness, and resourcefulness are firmly set in stone by the last sentry slowly succumbing to the trank dart as he watches on silently. There's a sense that every second and factor was accounted for, so that in the end it'd be just him and Ocelot left there. Ocelot then gets read for absolute fucking filth, and it's glorious. Snake correctly identifies his technique, but also his inexperience with it, leading to his downfall. Snake suggests he use a revolver instead, counters the knife attack, and then says,
"You're pretty good."
You're pretty good. Just what I'd expect from the man with the same code as the boss.
Pretty good.
It's just such a perfect confluence of character. You can see exactly why Ocelot would become so obsessed with this man, but also the potential Snake could see in him. The things Ocelot wants, in terms of his ability, Snake has, and so its respect has been earned. The way these characters and eventually their bond is elucidated isn't just through the distinct actions they take, but how the camera frames them, how the scene is structured to create connections between them, and how imagery is exploited. Like the bullet casing that causes the jam flying through the air in dramatic slow motion, ringing out amongst the now quiet factory floor, soon rolling by Ocelot's writhing, humbled body. It's all incredibly brilliant and a testament to just how perfect the time frame is here. The game is far enough removed from its predecessors that it's given some freedom over how characters are portrayed. At this point we have a keyframe of Ocelot in the 1960s and one in the 2000s. The space in between remains fuzzy and unknown, which means we can passively fill in the gaps or only acknowledge the recognizable parts, taking everything else as just new information to enjoy. The "you're pretty good" line, which calls back to Ocelot's use of it in MGS1, doesn't read as hokey and forced. It's one cute detail in an otherwise original sequence, just enough to remind us these are people we already know, but still removed enough so that we can feel like we're learning who they were before they became those people. This in itself plays into the idea of the times, how people are changed by their experiences and the circumstances that create them. Metal Gear Solid 3's use of cinematic techniques is amazing, and this standard is upheld throughout the game. Not every scene has quite so much heavy lifting to do in terms of plot, character, and theme, but there's always something intentional happening when you're in a cutscene. You have faith that it's worth paying attention to. So as to reorient the priorities and power scaling of the plot, you get a look at the weapon Sokolov is working on once you catch up with him. It's called the Shagohod, an all-terrain tank capable of firing nukes. Its design makes a lot of sense as a proto-Metal Gear. It looks more mammalian, closer to the ground and sturdy. It almost suggests that Rex evolved from the Shagohod to be able to walk on 2 legs rather than 4. Things get more interesting as Snake and Sokolov cross the bridge. The boss shows up. Now that Snake and his prowess has been established, and the player knows how to play, it's time to take him down a peg, to flip things on their head. The boss's former Cobra unit allies arrive in a swarm of hornets and sudden torrential downpour, Sokolov snatched amidst the chaos. Snake isn't the only one confronted by someone of his past. We also see former Cobra member the Sorrow over the boss's shoulder, as a sort of spirit, the rain his tears. The game rapidly introduces these more fantastical elements in such a way so as to incite intrigue rather than frustration. So much wild shit is happening that you have to sort of just let it wash over you, and take solace in the fact that at least you're not alone. Snake's probably wondering the same thing. Things are brought back down to reality as the aforementioned Colonel Volgan enters, uttering a Japanese phrase, meant to ward off lightning and bad luck. Ironic considering his own apparent proficiency with controlling lightning. We find out that the boss is defecting, handing Volgan 2 Davy Crockett warheads, portable bombs with a relatively small impact, for a nuke that is. Snake grapples with the boss, though is easily overwhelmed, disarmed and given a broken arm in the process. It's an incisive encounter that deflates all the confidence and bravado accrued in his battle with the Ocelot unit. Volgan wants him dead because, no face, no case and all that, but the boss insists that she's the one to do it. The relationship between Snake and the boss is so fascinating because of the inherent vulnerability. Solid Snake didn't have this dynamic with anyone, Grey Fox and Master Miller being the closest, but they were always somewhat removed. Here in MGS3, every second they spend together is another moment in which Snake's past is open to us, a look into who made him and the obvious respect that commands within him. His instincts as a fighter are in step with his instinct to trust the boss, to rely on her, and so, even after taking apart his gun and snapping his arm, when she reaches her hand down, he takes it. The close-up here decontextualizes the rest of their bodies. For these moments, they look identical. It's only with our knowledge that she's the authority that tells us who's who in the frame, and that trust is exploited. He's not pulled in for an embrace, but for an elbow to the gut. He grabs at her in vain as he's tossed over the bridge, left clutching her bandana in his hand. Throughout the whole exchange, there's a distinct lack of lethality and cruelty. There's an underlying ambiguity and tension around the boss's motives. There's little conviction on her part. It's hard to spot any true belief in what she's doing. Her final lines,
"Drift away. My place is with them now,"
are uncommitted. They could point to a true defection or something murkier, as murky and ever-changing as the idea of a foe within a global context. This is conveyed visually through her positioning halfway across the bridge in a purgatory of alliance not quite crossed over to the other side yet. Snake washes up on a shore further down the river and is coached in healing his wounds by paramedic. The final thing he applies to support his arm is the boss's bandana. Waiting to be picked up by the Fulton extraction system, he sees the Shagohod being transported overhead. Volgan admires the warheads in one of the helicopters. He wants to put the US in a tight spot. Using the American warhead to blow up Sokolov's research facility, they can pin the blame on the Yanks and cause more unrest within Khrushchev's ranks. It's a cruel, self-serving move that shines a light on what's at stake here. The mushroom cloud that grows from the impact site portends what the Shagohod could deliver upon the world, and ends the Virtuous Mission. After a gauntlet of a learning curve and a bummer ending, this now iconic section really cements the game's visual and storytelling tone of James Bond-style 20th century pulp. It's larger than life in a way that allows for comedy, absurdity, but also authentically felt drama. There's an elasticity to it that really suits Metal Gear. The bold choices also excuse a lack of subtlety and provide cover for when it is there. Narrative and thematic layers can be effectively implemented in a way that makes digging deep into the game quite rewarding. There's also a metatextual element to it. Metal Gear as a series is so reflexive and indebted to its own conventions and reoccurring ideas, and this echoing of Bond is acknowledgement of that. There is some relevance to the imagery, of course, it's not all just homage. We see the influence of the times on the world via newspaper headlines and pages being constructed, words falling into place or sliding off screen, as though narratives are literally constructed onto a page to be made so. The effects of this are then communicated via the camouflage patterns. They gestate into or form continents, planes, and so on, generally shifting as needed. Amongst all this and the various gameplay clips is the skeletal forms of snakes, whether representing Naked Snake alone, Snake and the Boss, the subjects of Laissez-Fontaine, Solid, Liquid, and Solidus, or maybe those three in Big Boss as well. We see how the sly, capable but ultimately deprived and destroyed snakes try and weave through this torrent of change and consequence. The sequence evokes the legacy of its own continuity, but also the more immediate ideas being explored. Then we're back in it. It's 1 week later, once again nearing Russia. Since the explosion of the Davy Crockett was registered right as an American aircraft was determined to be in violation of Soviet airspace, the US government is the one getting the blame. To clear the Seppo's name, you have to take out the boss, and ideally do something about Volgan along the way so Khrushchev can maintain his power. In addition, the feds want the Shagohod destroyed and Sokolov rescued. The KGB have put Fox in contact with the two NSA codebreakers from 1960, codenamed Adam and Eve. They should be able to help Snake out. The first objective is to rendezvous with Adam at the factory where you found Sokolov. This time, Snake isn't performing a halo jump, but using a one-man drone to land. This puts him in league with Solid Snake, who in Metal Gear Solid 1 made his approach in a one-man vehicle as well. Already, visual illusions are being leveraged to show how Naked Snake is changing, becoming hardened into Big Boss. This is reflected in his equipment. This time around you only have a lethal pistol, without a suppressor at that. That safety net has been taken away to emphasize the need to exercise your new stealth skills, though even that won't last for long. The neighing of a horse and a snake draped over a tree branch foreshadows the imminent meeting with the boss. Entering a small clearing, you see that the horse is white, or perhaps pale. The symbol of a white horse or pale horse is most commonly associated with the four horsemen of the apocalypse, more specifically conquest and death respectively. And in this case, either could be appropriate. The boss's changing allegiance would be seen by the US government as a move to aid conquest, but this idea could just as easily be flipped as her real intentions are illuminated. But to me, this symbol more specifically relates to her relationship with Snake and how that relates to death. She stalks Snake and haunts this mission, pointedly not killing him, mind you, but being a distinct reminder of the threats he faces and the existential threat she could pose with her superior skill. The boss's first line in the scene references death not being ready for Snake, in fact. She then discards her smock and charges at him, wearing a suit that, due to its colouring and pattern, is sort of evocative of a skeleton, or at least as much as a cutting-edge combat-ready uniform can be. She then disarms Snake and takes his gun apart again. The dynamic here remains unclear. The weight of the emotions at play is a testament to the depth of their connection, and the boss is still not killing Snake, but she also comes across as more frustrated than angry, annoyed that he's returned here. We also are beginning to understand how the boss is imprinted upon Snake, as she uses very similar CQC moves against him, as he did against the Spetsnaz earlier. She urges him to leave, believing he doesn't have what it takes to kill her or make the decisions that he'll have to about what he honours as a soldier, his country, or his beliefs. She then destroys the drone he flew in on, which can also be interpreted two ways, depending on her motivation. It could be a way to make it seem like he died in the crash, giving him some cover to escape, or it could be to draw the guards to truly test him. Regardless of the intention, the second one is what materializes, and so it's time to sneak past in the dark, truly naked now with no weapons. You are in familiar territory, but the mandatory caution phase, instigated by the discovered wreckage, reconfigures the encounters, ups the pressure, and acts as a great, reiterated moment of learning, one that's naturalistic and narratively motivated. It turns out that Adam couldn't make it to the factory, and the person who could doesn't seem to know the password, lali lule lo. However, she manages to prove herself by taking out all the guards who get the jump on you, introducing herself as Eva. They hole up in a room where Sokolov was being held, giving Snake a scientist disguise to get him into the weapons facility, a customized silenced tranquilizer, and a silenced M9. Eva then details the route for getting to Sokolov, the next step being to proceed through the nearby swamp and jungle until you reach a crevice that descends into a cave. So that's what purpose she serves expositorily here, a way to dictate your next steps and give you some useful gear, but there's obviously way more going on. It's time to talk about women. In my past videos on the Metal Gear series, I've been quite critical of how the female cast is written, and for good reason. In Metal Gear 1 and 2, this was handled in a poorly yet unfortunately unremarkable way. Women were rarely portrayed as actively skilled or capable, even if they're described that way, and first and foremost are judged on their sexual appeal to the men that surround them. Things get a bit more complex in Metal Gear Solid 1. The prior issues still apply, but the larger focus on Snake's character and the ways in which we're meant to relate to him mean that his chauvinism and machismo are framed as charming characteristics rather than the seedy, lecherous advances they really are. The sexualized reverence the women in the game reserve for him feels forced, and in some cases, like Naomi, directly flies in the face of their own role within the story, defying logic. Beyond this, women in MGS1 are shown to be overly emotional, but not in a way that provides any value, rather in a way that turns them into things that men can rescue or protect. Then finally, they don't contribute meaningfully to the mission. Naomi and Mei Ling's roles are purely supportive, Sniper Wolf is a villain, and Meryl's own journey and growth is stunted so she can become that aforementioned object to rescue. She gets turned into emotional shorthand for Snake's and the player's sake. Metal Gear Solid 2, a game that very much investigates how the player relates to the characters and symbols they inhabit, naturally looks into how that relationship treats women. Snake's success in winning Meryl, so to speak, isn't followed up on or really honoured in any way, yet Raiden, who's positioned as being the anti-Snake, less masculine, less powerful, less accomplished, is shown to be in a long-term, seemingly healthy relationship, in a way tacitly decrying how women were treated in the earlier games. Of course, later the relationship proves to in fact be incredibly unhealthy, and Rose herself gets painted into that familiar corner of being a nag, too emotional and illogical. MGS2 doesn't come out unscathed with its writing of women, but it is more nuanced and thematically consequential at the least, so that's some progress I suppose. Which then brings us to MGS3 and most importantly Eva. Looking at the images on screen during the scene would make you think that things have regressed a little. One of the first things Eva does is unzip her jumpsuit. She uses very suggestive language, all while Snake coolly blows it off, as if he's above her presumed promiscuity. After they rest up overnight, you see her getting dressed again. But what's crucial here is how these actions are framed, specifically from the angle of character. In the prior games, Snake's remarks and one-liners were foisting a woman's sexuality onto her. If he never said anything, it never would have been brought up. Mei Ling, Meryl, Nastasha, they had no control over this part of themselves. Their sexuality existed purely in relation to Snake and what he wanted to say and imply. It was gross and disempowering. But here, all of Eva's actions and suggestive language is of her own volition, and not in a way that merely serves as a cop-out, it's in line with her role. Eva, as a fellow spy, is using her sexuality to disarm people. Their presumptions over a woman's ability is something she can leverage to her own ends, and the game knows exactly what it's doing. If you press RB while Eva introduces herself, the first time you hear her say her name will be while your frame centered right in her chest, her face nowhere to be seen. What we see here is the game giving us the rope with which to hang ourselves. Last time, Raiden was used to shine a light on how players imagine themselves versus who they really are, in the process exploring how a video game creates false narratives and realities and how people buy into them for their own sake. This time, instead of such an elaborate construction, the game merely gives you the option. Either you can look at Eva as a person while she introduces herself, or you can zero in on her as a sexual object. If you do the latter and all you think is awesome tits, the game's actively making fun of you. The little saxophone lick is one of mockery. If you do the latter and laugh, you understand the absurdity at play and are probably most like Naked Snake, someone who knows how you're being played and teased but can't help but indulge anyway. If you don't press right bumper at all, congratulations, you are the #1 women respecter. The crown will be personally placed atop your head by Bell Hooks and Sarah Ahmed themselves. Eva is an active participant in her own sexuality, which in contrast to previous characters makes her empowering rather than disempowering. Beyond the subject of her sexuality, the way she takes out the guards here immediately shows that she's more than just her body, and very soon after, she's the one helping Snake out. She's the authority within the limits of the mission and is privileged in terms of information. Eva is leaps and bounds more interesting and consequential when compared to other women in the series, and is self-evident proof of why more characters like this are important, because the interplay between her and Snake is incredibly compelling, more so than Rose and Raiden and Meryl and Snake. She directly plays off of and into Snake's uncertainty and arising insecurities. He's no longer able to trust the boss, but also unwilling to completely let her go, and so he's cagey about trusting Eva. The pair acknowledge that neither of them can really trust each other, yet they have little option. The times have pushed them to this position and aggravated the tension that simmers away between them. Despite Snake's reticence, his relative lack of experience and discipline is shown by his response to Eva's advances. He's initially pretty unfazed, as he fawns more over the custom pistol than Eva herself, but then later seems more bashful than uninterested when she teases him before he dozes off. The weapon is a pivotal building block in this relationship. We've explored how he began with a lethal weapon to limit our options. That was then dismantled by the boss, leaving us even further exposed. And now we've been given exactly what we need by Eva, someone who's aesthetically reminiscent of the boss. This weapon is a symbol of trust and reliability, of comfort in a tight situation, and at the moment Eva is providing it and the boss is trying to take it away. And that helps us make sense of and become invested in the overlapping relationship here. The next day, they wake up to being surrounded by the Ocelot unit. Eva's gifts come in use right away, as you're able to use them in your prior knowledge of the area to take out the guards, even in this heightened state of alert. In what's now a series tradition, a simple reorientation of the player within a space completely changes how you engage with it. In this case, showing how Snake's failure earlier has changed his position within the conflict, as he's the one being pursued as opposed to Sokolov. Once the unit are taken out, we see that Ocelot has Eva hostage. He's kept the bullet that jammed his gun earlier, and it now hangs around his neck, brandishing a revolver like Snake suggested. Ocelot also gropes Eva, finding out she's a woman, which is an interesting parallel to what happened to Raiden in MGS2 by way of the President. I wonder if it's a connection being drawn about how these people are treated for defying the expectations of how they should act or present. A more feminine man like Raiden, and notably unlike Snake, is assaulted for taking on his role in Sons of Liberty the same way Eva is here for being a woman and daring to have some level of agency. It underscores Ocelot's general bitterness. Although admiring Snake's performance earlier, he feels scorned and has something to prove. His words are delivered with a venom that reflects this, though Snake still manages to prevail. This time he mocks the aesthetics of the single-action army, noting that the engraving is frivolous and tacky. This contrasts what we've just seen Snake do, which is use his knife to carve a notch into the trank gun to accommodate holding a knife while still gripping the gun. Snake's willing to ruin the purity of something to improve its practicality, while Ocelot will invest into the appearance of something with no thought to practicality, a fitting representation of each one's outlook and rigor. Snake's most biting comment though is that Ocelot doesn't have what it takes to kill him. Ocelot tries to prove him wrong, but has miscounted the bullets left in the chamber, firing 2 blanks and giving Eva a chance to free herself, kicking him to the ground. She then flips onto her bike and tricks off of Ocelot's face, a great reaffirmation of her power and ability. She does raise her weapon to shoot Ocelot as he flees, but Snake stops her, seeing potential in him, hoping he'll grow from the mistake. With some more motorbike acrobatics, Eva is off to her other role. This encounter is a lot briefer than previous ones, though that's reflective of its place in the story. What's important is how Eva asserts her character here. She's not here to fuck around and baby Ocelot into being a better fighter, and so the second the opportunity presents itself, she kicks him to the ground and the slow pace of the scene with him. Once she's in control, she completely turns the tables and diffuses any threat within like 40 seconds. A good demonstration of just how amped up she makes things. In the earlier scene, Ocelot slowly crawling to retrieve a bullet was the temporal device used to build intra-scene drama. Here, it's Ocelot's knife flinging up into the air after he's made into a human vert ramp. The whole thing's resolved with much greater efficiency. Although Eva is of great consequence in this scene, she doesn't blot out what's continuing to build here between Naked Snake and Ocelot. The continued dispatching of advice with small slights, admonishments and embarrassments feels like a way in which Snake is reclaiming that dynamic between him and the boss. He can't fully let it go, and so he's taking on that role for someone else. The building rapport between Snake and Ocelot helps inform the way in which we relate to Snake. How a player sees themselves in contrast to the protagonist is really crucial throughout the series, particularly the Solid titles. In MGS1 there's a duality to how we relate to Solid Snake. On one hand, he is his own person with a distinct personality and arc, but on the other you connect with him via a shared ignorance. He learns about twists right as we do, and so he acts as a conduit through which our curiosity can be quenched and questions answered. This ignorance is also a channel that much of the thematic content is directed through, and so it's an important part of the story, helping you connect with and understand it. Then in MGS2 we're presented with practically the exact same dynamic, but this time via Raiden. Through a character who's less of an aspirational figure to an assumed straight male player, the game makes us question an audience's role in a story, and how narratives can be spun and manipulated in real life for political ends. Raiden is a confrontation, someone we must come to terms with, and in doing so accept ourselves more, and the thematic implications that idea has within the story. What we find in MGS3 is something slightly new. It's largely a recreation of what I laid out for MGS1, but it's using continuity to give it a new slant. Thanks to our previous experience with Big Boss, Ocelot, and any other returning elements, we're afforded a more nuanced and informed view of them. Naked Snake doesn't have to be as aspirational because we understand what he will become, and so we connect with him explicitly via his process of change. So in these repeated encounters with Ocelot, we're able to relate to the potential Snake sees because we understand that it will be realized, even if it's as some gun-spinning, arm-stealing, triple-crossing freak. This connection between player and protagonist is then informed by the times, or scene generally. We have the before and the after, the context, and so now we get to explore how this shapes the events that will take place. Within this aspect of the game, the implicit vulnerability that Snake's past with the boss exposes, that I mentioned during the end of the Virtuous Mission, acts as a door to better insight into how these events are affecting Snake. Our relationship with the character we control isn't as complex as in MGS 1 or 2, but it is better edited. There's a seamlessness to it that keeps you exactly where the game wants you to be in regards to Snake, and it'll use that really well later down the line. Now that we're 47 minutes and 49 seconds into this video about a video game, I reckon it's about the right time to properly talk about the gameplay. Yeah, I spent a very long time dwelling on story and character, but it's an homage to Kojima? Yeah, that's the excuse I'll use. After navigating the famous tropical swamps of Russia and then some claymores, electric fences and dogs, you come to probably the most important screen of the game, in terms of gameplay at least. Mostly because it's a great case study for why gameplay works so well in MGS3, and I'm quite fond of anything that proves me right. What's so crucial about Bolshaya Pass Base is that it's undeniably a sandbox. There's an objective, getting to the other side, but there's no set path, and the game's systems are entirely relied upon to fill in the space of the sandbox, acting as catalysts for play. It's just you, your tools, the guards, and a space. This is the structure for the entire game, and a large part of why it works so well and better than other Metal Gear games. MGS1 no doubt relies on its mechanics for its fun, but does so within rather restricted, largely dictated spaces. Lots of corridors, narrow hallways, and small sections within a space completely cordoned off from others, limiting overlap in interaction. Metal Gear 1 and 2 are similar, though often had larger spaces interestingly. Then on the other hand, we have MGS5, which has a couple open world areas which struggle to come together as a complete whole, wrestling between being truly open, while still needing ways to cut off the player's line of sight and frame their approach to a base or outpost, meaning that the sandbox can frustratingly impose limits on you. MGS1's method still works, but is restrictive and constrained by the range of weapons and tools at your disposal. A different playthrough struggles to feel truly different. The Phantom Pain fails structurally by misunderstanding its own priorities and refusing to properly accommodate them. The story is completely out of step with the game's structure and leaves the pacing feeling disjointed, stratifying your gameplay in the process for an overall awkward experience. Metal Gear Solid 3 hits the perfect structural balance, falling somewhere in between the extremes of MGS 1 and 5. It's a series of small sandboxes linearly connected by hallways, which in practice manifest as brief loading screens. This allows the experience to be designed enough to keep the narrative pacing intact, while still giving room for experimentation, personalization, and meaningful decision-making on the gameplay side. This structure is, I think, probably the single most consequentially positive decision the game makes. That sounds like a bold thing to say, but I can't think of anything else that tops it really. Everything else I love about this game, which is pretty much everything else it does, is influenced by its structure. It underlines the entire experience and allows that experience to be molded by the player. If you want to race through to prioritize story, go for it, you just have to get to the other side of a screen for most of it anyway. But if you want to dwell and explore and discover things, that's accounted for as well. And Bolshaya Pass Base is perfect for just that. I've purposely not really talked about the true breadth of what you can do in MGS3 because I was waiting for this moment, a moment where all of its systems and mechanics cohere into greatness, and in such an undeniable way that it becomes representative of what the entire rest of the game does design-wise to varying degrees. To me, the spaces in Snake Eater can be broken down into 3 separate passes of design, so to speak, so let's cover them. The first pass is where broader decisions that define the space generally are made. During the Virtuous Mission we covered this, the creation of interesting interplays of constriction and freedom within layout and geometry, acting as the basis from which guard placement can then be decided, ultimately creating the definitive limits of where you can go and when. Bolshaya Pass base really opens this first pass up with 2 different entrances, a bare perimeter, save for grass patches which allow for easy observation, and enemies that give each other a pretty wide berth, wide enough that even if you make a mistake and someone comes to investigate, you can generally recover. These are the basic parameters you can work with and make up what the first pass of design tends to look like. The second pass brings in the vast expanse of additional considerations. We have the aforementioned grass patches, a moat around the central building which serves as a hiding place but also a way to limit movement. There's mounted turrets, electric fences which can be de-electrified, the ability to climb up onto the roof of that central building, a storehouse of food and another of explosives. These things add character and make the space unique, carving out potential for interaction. The third and final pass of design is the systems and items that the player wields to create that interaction. You get to define it. There's the survival consideration of camouflage, stamina, injuries, and inventory which will affect your priorities and how you play. Then there's the contents of that inventory. Things like the cardboard box, myriad radars, binoculars, weapons, distraction tools, animals, plants, grenades, magazines, and more. All these things are at your disposal, so you can choose how to navigate the space. The first 2 passes of design meet the third and encourage the decision-making process. Or, to remove the abstraction a little, the things that are dictated by the game are what empower the player to make their own choices, to experiment and personalize play. One doesn't work without the other. And that's what's so compelling. You recognize, even if only subconsciously, that you have an impact here, and that whatever path you carve will be yours. And it does this all within a measured, digestible space that isn't weighed down by its own ambitions and size. Maybe this doesn't seem that special. All I'm really describing is the appeal of sandbox games, I suppose, which certainly isn't novel. So let's get a little more specific, or really cerebral. First off, it's important to stress that this is a stealth game. Inherent to that fact is the understanding we have as players that to be spotted is to fail, even if you can recover and eventually carry on like nothing happened. So while one sandbox game may have the simple objectives to not die and make sure everything else does die, Metal Gear Solid 3 has another layer on top of this. To not die, but also not get spotted, implicit within which is the aspiration to not kill anything else either. These objectives require deep engagement with the space, but also your toolset. As a player, I'm looking to succeed, and seeing as most games have some level of resource management, I'll naturally gravitate to the solution which is the most efficient resource-wise, but a player that's prioritizing efficiency is unlikely to exercise much creativity, and I often feel that sandbox games fall into this trap. They don't foster creativity and experimentation in a way that really activates me. There's little in their design which necessitates it. They rely on external curiosity while not doing much to actually spark it. But with the additional consideration of stealth, MGS3 forces you to account for not just survival, but perfection, and that's the spark I need. When I enter a new area in Snake Eater, my main concern isn't just getting to the other side, but how I can do so while making, at first glance, the absolute smallest impact possible. To me, the greatest satisfaction comes from exiting an area with the knowledge that the game ostensibly never even knew I was there. Like suddenly one of the game's flags goes off and it has to scramble to start the next cutscene because it never caught sight of me. So MGS3 combines its stealth identity with a clever structure to craft exceptional sandboxes, but how else does it get the player to truly invest? Similarly to its level and system design, I think it does so via a 3-tiered hierarchy of decisions which guide and encourage play. These decisions are either immediate, short-term, or long-term, and when taken as a whole implicate the entire suite of systems and mechanics that Snake Eater has to offer. As we break down these different decisions, you'll notice that they overlap with the 3 different design passes I outlined earlier. These are the moments of harmonic communication happening between the disparate parts, which are on full display here in Bolshaya Pass base. First, we have immediate decisions. These are ones of management or mechanical necessity, meeting the needs of the player but also Snake himself, so primarily decisions satiating the range of survival considerations and the players want to explore. This begets interactions with the environment around you, sorting out what the camo index allows for in the given environment, spotting and learning about new animals and plants, figuring out which ones best fill the stamina meter and the conversations they spark between Paramedic and Snake. Oh god, I haven't even got into paramedic or SIGINT yet. Oh, this video is going to be so long. The consequences of these decisions range in their severity as they're more contextual and dependent on circumstance. Sometimes they're a priority and others they aren't, but at the very least, they guide the player on a more instinctual level and inform the next type of decision. These are short-term, decisions you make whose ramifications don't reverberate past the current area. Principally, this refers to guard interactions, but I think they can also be inherited from immediate decisions via the desire to look for new items, as these things then affect what those short-term decisions can be. You can kind of drown in the depths of these decisions, there's just so much you can do. You could just shoot a guard, or you could get up close and personal for some CQC. This could mean slamming them on the ground to knock them out, or it could mean snapping their neck, or slicing their throat, or using them as a human shield, or interrogating them for some information like certain codec frequencies which call off alert sequences, or details of items that are hidden in the area. But even beyond combat interactions, you can throw empty gun magazines as a simple distraction tool. You could tranquilize a poisonous animal and then throw it at them, which will then poison and kill the lucky recipient. The porn magazines from MGS2 return. And then even if you do just trank someone, you could then decide to shoot out their radio so they can't call for backup. The thing is, my head is kind of swimming right now, and hopefully the slab of text I've just had to use is proof enough that there are lots of ways to interact with guards, that short-term decisions allow for ownership over your play. Then there are long-term decisions, which are those that affect the game beyond the current area. There aren't tons of these, but they feel weighty and have some pretty substantial gameplay consequences, and conveniently, 2 of them are available right here in Bolshaya Pass Base. First is the food shed. By using TNT found in the back corner, you can destroy the food shed, which will deprive sentries later on of provisions. This will make them especially hungry, meaning that food will serve as a better distraction. More than that, their desperation will make them eat food even if it's rotten, causing them to throw up, basically ignoring everything else and eventually passing out, I believe. The other opportunity we have here is to blow up the helicopter, which will then mean that, like 5 hours later when you're ascending a mountain, you won't have to deal with that helicopter surveying the area. Instead, you just have a few guards on floating platforms. I'm sure you can already spot the fluidity and exchange of influence present amongst these 3 tiers of decision making. Snake's material needs and your curiosity will directly affect the circumstances under which you interact with guards, in turn augmenting the short-term decisions you make. Short-term decisions like firing a gun over time morph into long-term decisions as you now have an empty magazine that you can equip at any time to throw as a distraction item. When you then layer in the 3 passes of level design as well, you get essentially a constantly gestating, self-sufficient ecosystem that rewards a player for investing into it via their skill and agency. This doesn't just allow for fun, it helps the player forge a connection with their gameplay, with the game, and beyond that, with the narrative. I mean, just think about the lifespan of an item in this game. Let's say you find yourself pretty hungry, and so the first priority upon entering a new area is to find some food, as having low stamina will cause Snake's hand to shake in first person and also his stomach to rumble, which guards will hear. So you pick up a couple pythons, tranking the last one instead of killing it. Then you enter Bolshaya Pass Base a little later. Having refilled your stamina, you can focus on just exploring and getting through unscathed. This insurance allows you to try using the snake you picked up earlier on a guard. He stabs it, but not before being bitten himself. As you crawl past his body, you pick the snake back up as a food item. You end up leaving Bolshaya Pass Base having blown up the food shack. A few hours later, the guards sound awfully hungry and you spot in your inventory that same snake, now having turned rotten as you forgot about it. You throw it in the guard's path, chuckle as he spills his guts and slink by easily. Over the course of hours, this single snake started out as the result of an immediate decision, found use as a short-term decision, and then could later be recycled in a way that leveraged a long-term decision. And let's think about the mechanics that this little adventure engages with. It requires the use of camouflage, stamina, Snake's suite of movement options, the inventory system, a range of weapons, unique enemy interactions, and depending on how you play, potentially a variety of radars, distraction items, and the cure menu. It's practically everything the game has on offer. This journey is contextualized by the structure we covered at the beginning of our little Bolshaya Pass Base excursion. The level of player empowerment here is incredible considering it does so while retaining great pacing, making sure to lace that empowerment with character moments as well. Mind you, these are exceptional examples. Not everything has the potentiality of a poisonous snake, and not every area is as dense as Bolshaya Pass Base. But the reason I use these 2 examples is because they contain the whole. Even if you were to simplify and thin out everything I've outlined regarding the structure and its relationship with gameplay, you would still find a multitude of compelling, inventive ways to get from A to B. Every area is a new opportunity. Fuck that, every area is 20 new opportunities, and you get to choose which one will ultimately be. Thankfully, the game's been kind enough to use ever-present externalities like stamina and guards to provide some subtle limitations so that decision-making isn't quite so daunting. Okay, let's take a moment to decompress after all that. It was a lot, I know, but just listing the items you can use and the ways in which you can use them would be doing a disservice to the game's design. It would be like focusing on what one person said in a conversation between 6, ultimately devoid of the larger context that informs what was said and why. So I'm not going to get into all the distinct items and guard interactions and so on. We've had the more important discussion already. The only exception being the crocodile hat, because it's cute. Oh, and the tranquilizer. Yeah, although the game's put in all this work to create a suite of mechanics and systems that work together to sustain an equilibrium of fun, challenge and player empowerment, it's then gone and threatened to topple the whole thing with one single weapon. The tranquilizer is incredibly powerful as it's silent, plentiful and relatively instant. Its use promotes the least amount of risk out of the entire item sandbox while also being the most versatile and effective. There's really no downside in terms of successfully pulling off stealth to just tranking whoever you can as soon as you see them. However, playing this way would be doing a disservice to yourself, as I think it's pretty plainly a significantly less fun approach, unless you're using it to speedrun maybe. I could see some people getting overwhelmed with the controls and the chaos of alert sequences and then just sticking with what works, that being the trank. But for the most part, I'd hope that people aren't so incurious as to deprive themselves of what's on offer. Mind you, the trank gun isn't an invalid option. If the player cares to experiment and try new things, it acts as a bedrock of safety which only encourages more experimentation, as you know that you have that in your back pocket. I know personally that's why the sandboxes in Snake Eater make me feel more comfortable experimenting when compared to its contemporaries. It's just that it can also become a crutch or bad habit for some people, which is a shame. Moving on from the honourable Bolshaya Pass base, you arrive at Bolshaya Pass Crevice, where you find Ocelot. Snake and his relationship continues to evolve in an interesting way. Ocelot's developed a sort of infatuation with Snake. Not necessarily romantic, though I deeply respect anyone who sees, draws or writes it as so, but nonetheless devoted to some extent. Ocelot sees Naked Snake as prey in a similar way to how Sniper Wolf saw Solid Snake. Enemies, but finding connection, passion and drive within that. We see this dynamic arise in how it's pointed out that Ocelot's hunt alone, and so he wants it to be a one-on-one duel, but then despite that he still calls on his unit to pin Snake in. Ocelot wants him there, to himself. The times is insinuated by the chasm that separates them, two people who fought before and learned from each other yet kept apart as though to stop them from getting too close. The ravine also helps define the visual communication as well. Previous scenes between the two are largely confined, focused on the details and intricate movements, but with space they become equalized as figures, as fighters and participants. It's hard to establish dominance when they barely fit in a frame together and are planted on even ground. It's all wonderfully summed up by the shots that immediately precede the encounter. We see how Snake fits into Ocelot's personage, between his hand and his hip, where his gun rests. We then see that equalizing again with the contrasted brows, and finally the distance put between them, emphasized by the wind. The actual boss fight is then very fitting. It's a culmination of Snake's advice, at once acting as a reference to Solid Snake's first tangle with Ocelot, a pistol duel. It isn't particularly involved, but that feels appropriate for a first boss. It's essentially a shooting gallery, but one that's well constructed and with a decent amount of tricks up its sleeve, including some fun ones, like the soldiers laughing at you if you put the croc cap on. You end up being interrupted by the pain, swarming the area with hornets. Snake sees only one way to give him the slip, and so jumps down the ravine. The fall is emblematic of Snake's minute progress, and so the tone of gameplay shifts in turn. The focus is purely on survival, on using the spare light of your cigar to guide you while hunting for food and supplies. I have touched on how the stamina bar itself informs gameplay decisions and flow, but it's also important to make a point of just how radical a shift this is. With a stamina bar, you can no longer rely on rations to instantly heal you outside of the life medicine you can find sparingly. You instead have to keep yourself fed with a fuller bar resulting in quicker health regeneration. These changes give mistakes permanence, they have a lasting impact on how you play. Each injury is a reminder that you need to be careful, a reaffirmation of the boundaries put upon you. This in itself has a large impact as it redefines the dynamics of gameplay and how you interact at large with the game and the situations it's designed for you. This shift plays into the ecosystem I outlined earlier and naturally slots in as another avenue through which the game guides you while not making choices for you. As you stumble through the caves, it's a good opportunity to catch up with the support crew, Paramedic and Sigint. The ways in which these two complement and contrast Snake is really special. They help round him out as a character in a way that builds out who they are as well. Paramedic and Snake have a rather typical back and forth. Snake's flirty and probably too forward, and then Paramedic reciprocates because of course she does. The player needs to have their ego fed after all. But then as things go on, you realise that the banter they have is genuine. Snake plays up his curiosity about how all these wild animals taste to gross out Paramedic, and Paramedic goes on and on about old movies to put Snake off balance in a way that grounds him. The flirtiness reveals to be a natural chemistry, one that, when backed up by Eva's characterization, feels less like chauvinism being rewarded and more like two people who are simply on the same wavelength. Sigint is kind of a slant on this. He remains much more straight-laced, but Snake's still able to mess with him for some fun moments, and there is palpable mutual respect between them. Game recognizes game in a way that allows for lighthearted fun, but also thematically relevant conversations. Which, it's worth restating something from my MGS1 video. The codec is a gameplay tool that allows the player to decide when these relationships develop, and depending on your level of engagement, that development can feel designed and tailored with great specificity, respecting your choices. A good example of a call that builds character is one about the Davy Crockett you can have with Sigint. It starts out as you'd expect, a standard explanation of what the rocket is and its origin, specifically its name and the reference that Volgan made to it. But then Sigint alludes to Snake's responsibility, and suddenly the call ends on a dramatic note, an abrupt sign-off with Snake sounding off in his own head, contemplating if he'll be able to take the boss out. It's not massive, but it's further insight into how Snake feels about this, and proof that he's actually thinking of these things in between cutscenes. He feels realer for it. And these calls capture a range of moods with a similar level of poignancy, whether it's simple foreshadowing for the sidecar on Eva's motorbike, which Snake will use later, or Snake asking Sigint to get in the cardboard box, or Major Zero fanboying about James Bond. Each one is helping build something, and as you become more invested in the story, the value of what's being built is self-evident. Soon enough, you'll come to a basin in the caves and are confronted by the pain. As the first of the Cobra unit you face, he's naturally less consequential, but is at least a good ambassador for Snake Eater's own constructed reality. It acquiesces only in the ways it wants to, in the ways that serve it to. For example, the pain can just disappear out of a swarm of hornets he essentially conducts, yet they still disperse via a smoke grenade. Often enough, these decisions about what should and shouldn't make sense end up being the correct ones. They crystallize into interesting narrative developments, compelling images and illusions, or in this case fun dynamics for a boss. Once you've delivered enough pain unto the pain, he explodes into a cascade of hornets, his name echoing out one last time. The Cobras each choose an emotion to carry into battle, and by the end of the fight seem to explode more because that emotion becomes unbearably intense, rather than any damage your weapons have done. This is like a peek into Snake's possible future, so consumed by battle that it becomes the only avenue through which he can feel something. Exiting the caves, you have to stealth through water, which is a fun change of pace. It's in step with Snake's descent into the caves, as though it's hardened him a little. You feel less like an intruder and more like a hunter. Snake finds the entrance to a warehouse on the way to the lab, and we see much of the cast convene for the first time in a while. Sokolov is being escorted with Volgan in tow. He zaps Sokolov's partner Tatiana, which is the cover Eva's using. After this, Ocelot does some juggling Russian roulette bullshit, but fortunately the boss steps in to stop it. Which is great. The boss is given a lot of narrative respect. Her integrity and gravitas is never undermined for humour or absurdity. She's wonderfully self-serious amongst a group of entertaining tryhards. And so she can be effortlessly deployed in a situation like this to reorient a scene and tell the player that they should really start paying attention. This is a boon for pacing and exposition, but also for her as a character in itself. As such a towering figure, she looms over Snake as the thing he will ultimately have to overcome, not just in combat, but as someone he has a history with, and her elevation within the cast reinforces this. Like she did with Snake, the boss dismantles Ocelot's gun, which through his encounters with Snake has become a similarly symbolic item, a representation of his progress and growing capability, but evidently not capable enough to dislodge the boss. We see the end's old ass wheeled out by the fear, with Volgan frustrated at our continued survival and defeat of the pain. Volgan himself isn't very complex, but when contrasted by the surrounding cast, he doesn't really need to be. He's a simple, effective bad guy who provides a grounding for the story, where no matter what's happening, you at least know you want to send him to the essence. As a point of contrast, he allows us to ruminate on the thematic content. The way he treats Eva is so misogynistic that it plays off of the changed relationship we have to the protagonist this time, as not so much an admission of guilt, but at least an acknowledgement that this is bad and that the healthier, less chauvinistic relationship Naked Snake has to the women in his life is better than what we saw from Solid Snake. Volgan's also a monument to the times as an idea. These are the people that were able to ascend to power. In that way, he believably leaves a heritage that would lead to the events of MGS2. That game makes more sense if these are the types of people shaping our wars, social relations, and ultimately future. It's now time to get back on dry land and to the lab. The game's structure continues to self-justify, as the priority it prescribes to pacing also allows cutscenes to be what smooths the transitions between locations. The geography of Metal Gear Solid 3 is truly incomprehensible, but the rapid move from jungle to caves to swamp back to jungle by way of warehouse feels way less obtrusive than it should, thanks to the buffer given to these shifts by boss fights and cutscenes. This is also assisted by a heightened tone. It's refreshing to play a game which is not so adherent to intra-world immersion and consistency that it ends up castrating any sense of urgency in its own plot. It turns out if you make a story and characters that people care for, you don't have to worry about if the distance between A and B are realistic, and doing the former while not caring about the latter actually tends to be a benefit in both cases. Let's hope this isn't something that Kojima himself forgets. With such a robust suite of systems all working in perfect synchronicity, Metal Gear Solid 3 could get away with just being a couple dozen variations of Bolshaya Pass base back to back in terms of level design. In fact, it wouldn't just get away with it, it would still remain one of the greatest games ever made if it did so. So you gotta respect the fact that it very much doesn't do that. The Grand Design Bureau is the area most reminiscent of our now beloved little sandbox case study, a rather open area with unique obstacles and plenty of freedom of approach, but then it completely flips things on its head once you're inside. Using the scientist disguise given to you by Eva, you can effectively walk around freely, but you have to be careful. Crawling, rolling, bumping into guards or letting fellow scientists look too closely will give you up, and so the parameters for discovery have shifted. It's a great trick, one naturally imbued with tension thanks to the rules we've been operating under up until this point. I've played this game like 6 times and I still get a little nervous just walking around the lab because I'm worried someone's going to see through the disguise. For the most part, I've addressed the theme of scene as merely a way to discuss the times, the ways in which the flow of history intersects with power and influence to control people and the paths they take. But it's also worth delving into scene with a more literalist angle, focusing on the construction of the place and time and tone of the game. Metal Gear as a series has always incorporated humour, and I've mentioned the unique form of reality MGS3 specifically adopts, but we at once need to zoom out a little and talk with more precision to properly assess scene within the game. Let's discuss camp. We're also going to get into Kojima a lot, but I think it's all interesting. We all know what camp is, right? A work that is larger than life, often gaudy, extra, but somewhat unknowingly so, kitschy and cheap while aiming for opulence in a way that isn't necessarily trashy. Campy art can often be, without realizing it, subconsciously reaching to become something else, while the audience is very conscious of it. The seminal work on camp is Susan Sontag's essay Notes on Camp, from, fittingly for the topic of Snake Eater, 1964. I'm not going to measure the game against each of the almost 60 separate points she makes on the subject, especially because many of them are intellectualized and systematized in a way that isn't useful to us, but it's still worth noting some of her observations. I think chief among them, and which she covers in the intro, is that ultimately camp is a sensibility, a matter of taste. It's not so much a movement as it is an ineffable sort of energy which just happens to reside in something, whether that be a painting, performance, piece of furniture, movie, song, outfit, or whatever else. Camp has been projected onto it on a characterological level by someone. Framing camp as taste removes the limits of craft. Camp isn't emblematic of an artist's ability or lack thereof, but rather their sensibility and innate artistic instincts. It's a result of what happened at the time, filtered through people's own individual lenses on the way to completion. This designation of camp as a matter of taste is important to us as it's a great shorthand for understanding Kojima. From Snatcher to Death Stranding, everything he's made is indebted to exaggeration, drama, sincerity, stylization, all things which tend to be common amongst camp. The way I generally see it, if you have a Venn diagram of 2 circles, one labelled good taste and one labelled bad taste, Kojima exists right at the intersection of both. Logically, this makes no sense, but I think philosophically it does. It's not just me, right? We can all recognize how the things that are generally considered bad, as much as something can be, often work together with the good parts of Kojima's games, and that helps make them so compelling, that contrast. Anyway, like Sontag points out, these things are not employed in service of quality necessarily, or even employed consciously, they're just things that happen to reveal themselves in a work. And so Kojima's amorphous role in his projects as game designer, but also writer and also editor and also director, can be distilled more accurately as simply a filter. Everything that ends up in the final product has, largely speaking, been clarified through his taste. And so as we see in Metal Gear Solid 3, which occupies the time frame right after his birth, Kojima's referential palette becomes pieces of camp art, most notably the spy pulp of James Bond. So when we look at scene in Metal Gear Solid 3, we're not just getting the camp inherent to Kojima and his sensibilities, but the result of those sensibilities compounding with historically campy art as well. This underlies Snake Eater's entire vibe and is so infectious that I find it impossible to deny. I absolutely love it. It shows through wonderfully within the Granin Design Bureau, between Snake's rugged mug in a scientist's disguise, still wearing his bandana, the handkerchief and cigarette gas you pick up to knock people out, and finally the encounter with Granin himself. That's right, you don't find Sokolov here, but instead the eponymous scientist. He's munted, drowning his sorrows now that he's been made redundant by the emergence of Sokolov and his development of the Shagohod. Granin explains that much of the funding for Sokolov's work is from the Philosopher's Legacy, a massive amount of wealth secured between China, the US and Russia, later secured illegally by Volgan's father and then passed down to Volgan himself. Granin clarifies that the final test for the Shagohod are to take place the next day at the fortress of Gronzyj Grad. He then outlines how to get to Gronzyj Grad, giving you the punch card needed to proceed on that path. Camp, and beyond that scene, is so important to this conversation as it completely elevates it. Functionally, it's pure exposition, but camp transforms it into one of the most memorable interactions in the game. The premise of finding a high-ranking scientist so faded that he slips into the Bond villain telling you his plan role is already kinda heightened, but things just keep exaggerating from there. We see that the work of his that's being passed over for the Shagohod is literally Metal Gear Rex from MGS1, which takes place 40 years after this game. It seems like a safe assumption that the Shagohod itself is another artifact of a prequel, showing us the predecessor to what will come later. But nope, the more advanced thing has already been designed. This gets more on the nose and ridiculous when Granin then says he'll send these designs to his American friend in retaliation, that friend being Huey Emmerich, Otacon's dad. Then beyond that, he has a scale model of Metal Gear Ray in one of the Zone of the Enders mechs on his shelf. All of this is so much needless complication, like the game's tripping over obstacles that it's put there itself. Speaking of, when Granin highlights the evolution of bipedal weapons, Snake misunderstands and instead compliments the scientist's shoes, which is then cited as the reason Granin decides to help you, because he appreciated the compliment. This isn't the craziest cutscene in the Kojima oeuvre or anything, but it's undeniably campy, and campy in a way that improves the text, a great example of why this aspect is so pivotal to the game. The camp also helps highlight the evident contradictions, where Granin's love for his country fosters a selfishness for its validation, to the point where he'll give away its secrets in order to rid himself of Sokolov and become the top weapons scientist in Russia once again. These contradictions are representative of the times and show how the idea of an enemy becomes very fluid as the need for this fluidity arises. This in itself plays with loyalty. Granin, in his mind, must betray the USSR to best serve it, and Snake must collude with the purported enemy to accomplish what he can for his country. It takes what Campbell said post-torture in Metal Gear Solid 1, that the government must lie to its people and control them so that they can enjoy freedom, and personalizes it, shows how this thinking can, thanks to power, become systematized. With a way forward, you retrace your steps towards the warehouse, where you're ambushed by the Fear, setting the mood for the boss fight. He leaps between the trees while invisible, shooting you with poisonous darts. His animalistic features, the spider-like walk and forked tongue, and affinity for the jungle, can be used against him. My preferred strategy is to whittle down his stamina with a tranq, and then once it's low enough to make him hungry, I chuck some rotten food on the ground, which then attracts him and causes him to throw up, losing even more stamina. It's a well-placed boss fight as it allows you to indulge in some jungle shenanigans again after being deprived of them inside the lab earlier. The Fear follows the Pain's lead, exploding when defeated, overcome by his own prescribed emotion. It puts a neat point on Snake's potential outlook now, perhaps somewhat rattled by the knowledge of the Philosopher's Legacy and the looming completion of the Shagohod, in a similar way to how the Pain was deployed after Snake's fall and stagnation. You organise to meet Eva at the top of some mountains so she can help you get access to Gronzyj Grad, along the way having to take down the End. Probably the most memorable boss in the game, it's as much a battle of endurance as it is combat, having to track him down across 4 discrete maps, slowly doing damage as he snipes from ridges and hiding spots, also having the ability to restore stamina using the sun, as he can photosynthesize. It puts your relationship with the environment into keen focus and requires a level of planning beyond any other encounter in the game. Rather than acting as a way to break up typical gameplay, the End as a boss leans into it, takes it to another level. As you face off against him, the natural passage of time causes the process to take on its own narrative. You may struggle at the start before getting one over on him, which then compounds into some additional victories now that you're on the front foot. Maybe you lose him again as the rain starts to fall, muddying your vision before it halts. The humid jungle causes visible steam to rest in the valleys of each area, but you can then spot the muddy footsteps of your opponent, getting on a roll once more until you emerge victorious. Your own version of this fight can become self-mythologized in a rewarding way, and as he passes, you find that you respect the end rather than resent him. He's spent years upon years in these jungles, serving as a soldier, and rather than leave him scorned and desperate like it did with the pain and fear, it seemed to have left him quietly pleading, content with his own mortality. By forging a unique, symbiotic connection with the environment around him, he's able to define success on his own terms. As such, his death is more dignified, and to Snake may be a model that he learns from. The boss asked him earlier who he's loyal to, her or his country, but maybe the end shows an alternative to that. The sentiments and nascent emotional threads that run through the cutscene that follows his defeat softly crescendo to a poetically evocative final breath. It's undercut by his fucking teeth flying up in the air, but the mood's reaffirmed by his explosion being relatively non-violent, resulting simply in leaves wistfully flowing by. It feels appropriate that the game uses its most sympathetic boss to craft a fight in which you properly engage with its systems and mechanics honestly. The reward for taking him out non-lethally is the moss camo, which, as I alluded to earlier, is the only one that can get you 100% on the camo index, fittingly putting you most in sync with the environment. The pain was a way to typify a semblance of redemption after Snake's fall, with the fear reflecting the reality of his mission. The end is preceded by the infamous ladder. The 2.5-minute climb has you ascending to new heights, as if somewhat enlightened. It's also a moment to think on what you've been through as just the vocals, the most human element of the main theme plays. It also adds an element of otherworldliness to the fight you just had, like it was removed from true reality, which in itself could point to the end's ability to be so satisfied, like dismissing the rest of the world was how he could achieve that. The latter is just right, a dose of hypnotizing absurdity that mellows out into player-led introspection, a permission slip to decompress and consider. The satisfying repetitive pattern created by the lighting combines with the shrinking starting point to calcify into a meditative mood of triumph and empowerment. It's quietly perfect. Once at the top, you emerge onto the mountainside. The ascent provides a unique stretch of gameplay that utilizes verticality really well. This, combined with the lack of vegetation, leaves you fittingly, considering the surprising vulnerability of the end, quite bare. It's forcing you to divest from some tried and true tactics, to take some chances and try something new. You enter the small storage shed at the top and meet Eva. Although she's half naked, the two connect more over the scars that cover their bodies. Snake prods further about a particular one, and the sexual energy that does exist between them is finally directed as a way to deflect from true vulnerability. It highlights how a relationship like this is cursed and the cruel irony of that. They suit each other so well because it's their job to lie and kill, so they have a natural magnetism towards each other. But those same similarities also cause them to repel and push each other away when they get too close. These interactions feel so charged and engaging that they compensate for the relative small amount of actual time Snake and Eva spend together. The intimacy here doesn't have quite the same artifice as it did back in the factory. Their relationship has deepened, and yet all they've done since that first meeting was have a few codec calls together, ones that were rather expository and Spartan, mind you. It helps that David Hayter and Jodie Benson are at the top of their game. They completely understand the script and its tone, effortlessly navigating the conversation. And just to reiterate something, the power dynamic is important to the relationship's legitimacy too. Eva remains the authority when it comes to information, and giving her the power in this regard staves off the traditional power fantasy and equalizes them. This is put to great use as she gives us a key to an underground tunnel which will take you to Gronzyj Grad. After letting you know how to locate Sokolov, Eva asks about the boss. Once she does so, the scene's mood ices out. Suddenly Snake is repeatedly turning away from Eva, averting his eyes as though he can avoid what her words imply, that he's too close to the boss, he won't be able to kill her. Like with Granin, we see the times invoked as a sort of dialectical tool, a way to highlight a contradiction, so we can see if or how a character tries to resolve it. The camera mimics the conflict evident in Snake's body language, framing him from all different angles so we can see how he's moving about the space, trying to escape what's in front of him. Once the pair are finally face to face again, we see that Snake doesn't try to resolve the contradiction, instead turning things back on Eva, questioning her loyalties, her motives. It's the first time that the commonality in how they must interact with people, sparingly, cautiously, is weaponized rather than acknowledged with a casual smirk. They embrace, technically, but it's utterly loveless. The tension deflates into something tragic, yet realer than everything that came before. They've previously found ironic comfort in how doomed they are as a pair, but in this moment it's like they realize that if the times hadn't brought them to this point, if they weren't tools for their governments, they would fit well together as just two people. The interpersonal drama really helps fuel the thematic discussion happening, helping ground the narrative as a whole in human emotion without losing sight of its main ideas. This relationship, textually, isn't one of obligation, a way to appeal to a subset of people. It matters to the story just as much as the world-ending bombs. Back in Snake's boots, you head to the underground tunnel and must face off against the Fury. I'm really conflicted about him. From a story perspective, he's my favourite of the Cobras we've faced thus far, but in terms of gameplay, it's easily my least favourite. He's an astronaut who can fly around with a rocket-powered jetpack thing who then uses flamethrowers to attack. The corridors of the tunnel are used to funnel the flames, and as he goes, the ground becomes more and more covered in fire. His attacks and movement speed ramp up as he takes damage as well. It proves really difficult and is a fight that gets harder the longer it takes, which means that dying becomes extra frustrating as you tend to do so after a decent time investment. But the worst part is how things are communicated. When you start the fight, the Fury isn't actually in a state of alert, he only becomes so if he directly sees you. This means that you can get some decent damage in before he starts zipping all over the place. But the cutscene shows them face to fucking face. There's no reason why you'd suddenly think there's a stealth element to that encounter. This lapse in continuity really sets you up to fail, and then on top of that, the camo you get from a non-lethal kill is so specific that this very boss fight is pretty much the only place it'd be reliably worth equipping it in. I like the narrative aspect of the Fury because his theming is quite loaded. Space travel and exploration is a very idealistic venture. It's a symbol of progress, of an endless, limitless future. It's one of those things that in isolation is seen as purely good. Basically everyone agrees that it's worth knowing more about our world. It's a largely unifying sentiment. But during the Cold War, the space race was an ideological litmus test. The USSR used it to call back to the fervor and exciting change of the Bolshevik Revolution, while the US used it to exemplify American exceptionalism and the US empire's expansion, as well as the inherent virtue of that expansion as they saw it. Personally, I think the Russians won out. They were the first ones to send Yuri into space after all, shout out lesbians. Beyond the nationalist rhetoric though, was the understanding that space exploration also provided new opportunities for weapons development. So this thing, which can seem so pure and universal, was turned into yet another avenue for war, for violence. And the Fury exemplifies that. He went to space, but when he looked back upon the Earth, he saw darkness. He saw the thing he loved being perverted, and that destroyed him. He's the most theatrical of the bunch, but it totally works. His fury is his fuel, and we see that once he lifts off his helmet, all that fire is turned inward. The other Cobra's explosions felt like a more symbolic release of emotion, but this one is guttural. He doesn't just explode, he takes flight, willingly crashing into the ceiling, committing suicide more than anything. The signature echo of his namesake doesn't happen until his soul, I guess, as a flaming face, chases after Snake, partly collapsing the tunnel behind him. Beyond the ways in which the Fury obviously plays into the times and scene, he has a much more pronounced legacy. Since the release of Snake Eater, space travel and exploration has gone through yet another appropriation. Not by governments, but instead markets. Neoliberalism has caused the industry to become increasingly privatized, turning into the pet project of oligarchs and brain-rotted deadbeats destroyed by too much internet and ketamine. Even the pretense of the Cold War that this project was one of national pride has been dropped. Instead, private space travel is rubbed in our faces, to show that the people who hoard wealth are wasting it on meaningless vanity projects that could have their budgets used to, solve world hunger. You know, if they just felt like it. This is part of what's interesting about Snake Eater as a time capsule. Despite looking back, you can see how what it identifies and discusses has reoccurred between the mid-80s to now, just this time it was the market, via neoliberalism, which created the times under which it could all remain relevant. It feels pointed that Snake Eater came out amid the War on Terror, a time where the US openly lied to its people and ushered in a new wave of nationalism just so it could secure some oil money to the tune of millions of deaths. You know, at least the 50s and 60s had some semblance of a social safety net and upward mobility, so all the suffering being caused by the evil empire was helping some citizens. But by 2004, most of that shit had been eroded away and the economy was gearing up to collapse. At that point, the US was doing all the same shit from the 50s and 60s, but explicitly for a group of 12 guys. What does that remind me of? Emerging into Gronzyj Grad is a pivotal moment for the game, a way for the entire series' history to convalesce at once. It's obviously evoking Shadow Moses, with the interior stuff feeling more reminiscent of MGS 1 and 2, but the exterior sections also resemble Metal Gear 1 and 2 as well, made up of simpler structures with wider space. While very referential, Snake Eater's structure holds steady, as Gronzyj Grad's exterior is made up of 4 disparate yet connected sandboxes. This is the first time that MGS3's gameplay, rather than narrative, is in such close contact with the other entries, so why does this only happen now, over halfway through the game? I think it's meant to be reflective of Naked Snake's journey. By exploring Big Boss's origins, you're necessarily doing the same for Solid Snake, and so there needs to be a natural build-up, so that Solid Snake's solo sneaking missions amongst the metal and concrete of Outer Heaven, Zanzibar Land and Shadow Moses are ascribed some weight. Even Big Boss, the leader of 2 of those 3 bases I've just mentioned, had to build up to infiltrating something like Gronzyj Grad, which gives us a frame of reference as to Solid Snake's experience and expertise. The placement of Gronzyj Grad still holds up within its own locality though. The weapons lab feels representative of the change Snake's being forced to go through. The jungle as an environment provides cover and shadow and is self-sustaining. It's not glamorous, but it gives Snake a place to disappear into. Gronzyj Grad, by contrast, exposes him, which is echoed mechanically. It's tough to get the camo index that far above 50%, and the very angular geometry requires a level of commitment to your movements that wasn't quite there previously. The lighting is another thing, of course. It's all artificial and really feels like it. Running across some tarmac is inherently tense because you're keenly aware of the light and lack of nearby cover. The gameplay changes aren't too drastic, the mountains have prepared you for this less forgiving landscape, and the heightened tension is mostly contextual. It's not that sneaking in Gronzyj Grad is that much harder than elsewhere, but the change in scenery and presentation overall makes you think it's going to be, and so you naturally move with more caution, try to be more thorough in your observation. In successfully navigating this space, you become part of the catalyst for Snake's change. You help prove that he can overcome this exposure, this vulnerability, this uncomfortable place that the times has shoved him into. This all holds true for the interiors as well. You have to find Rykov, knock him out, and then drag him to a specific locker on the second floor so you can hide him and take his uniform. Using the uniform, you can head to the west wing of the lab, getting an ominous glimpse of the Shagohod along the way. You immediately overhear Sokolov handing Eva the Shagohod test data, with her then trying to get info on the Philosopher's Legacy. She has this faux lipstick which can fire a bullet, reoccurring a couple times, a cute symbol for Eva's methods, to use vanity and sexuality to disarm people so she can deliver the killing blow. Once she's left, Snake sneaks in to have a chat. In a continuation of the space talk and the thematic implications it brings, we learn that the Phase 2 tests are around the Shagohod's firing system. It involves speeding down a 3-mile stretch of land to fire an ICBM with increased acceleration, standing in for the first stage of a rocket, greatly increasing its range while remaining undetectable. If complete, the Shagohod's existence would create a power imbalance between nations that would shatter nuclear deterrence theory, the idea that no one fires a nuke because it would mean mutually assured destruction. In order to destroy the prototype before tests are complete, we need some C3 explosives, which Tatiana just happened to steal. We then get the obligatory "what have I created, what have I done" speech from a scientist that happens in each game. This one brings back around what the Fury represented, as Sokolov originally wanted to create space rockets. This iteration of the speech is less openly emotional, possibly because it's aware this is a repeated moment. It rings as more resigned and exhausted this time around, less revelatory. Sokolov's not given much time to dwell as Volgin soon enters. He's not buying Snake's disguise, and his method of checking whether this is Rykov or not is to grab his dick. Okay, let's pause here for a moment. I wouldn't say Metal Gear Solid 3 is self-conscious about MGS2's existence and the backlash that came with it. It's clearly building off of and is somewhat influenced by the changing relationship the players had with the protagonist in these games. I don't think you get the well-rounded relationship Snake has with the cast, particularly the boss, Eva, and Paramedic, without Raiden and what he means to the series. Yet at the same time, Snake Eater is more than willing to poke fun at the Sons of Liberty. The vector for this ridicule becomes Raiden. You can see it right away. If you select I like MGS2 before starting the game, upon landing from the Halo jump, Snake will remove his helmet only to be wearing a Rykov mask, which looks identical to Raiden. So the game's having some fun, pretending as though it's pulled the same trick twice, which is fine. That's the kind of standard MGS self-aware goofiness that I can get behind. Even having Rykov look so similar to Raiden and then inexplicably putting a Rykov mask in your inventory is something I can find some fun in. But beyond that, the game's relationship with MGS2 and by extension Raiden becomes quite odd for me. Principally, we have this moment we've paused on for now. Volgin says he's been waiting for Rykov in his room and then molests him as a form of identification. So we're not only implying that Volgin has a sexual relationship with Rykov, but evoking the molestation that happens to Raiden in MGS2. It's just completely removing all the complexity and nuance of Raiden as a character, to essentially just call him gay, derogatorily mind you. The underwear you see Rykov wearing when changing into its clothes and then this relationship with Volgin are clearly meant to be seen as embarrassing by the player. Not because Volgin's a villain or because the underwear is particularly goofy, it's just because these things imply queerness. The molestation Raiden suffers is meant to emphasize how he's been depersonalized. It plays into his androgyny and the reaction the player may have to that, but also how he's been controlled by his government. And so to take that meaning and then bastardize it for this odd bit of negatively framed queer coding of both Rykov and Volgin is really disrespectful of Raiden and what he represents. It's like MGS3 is agreeing with the people who dislike Raiden for the wrong, in some cases bigoted, reasons. It completely lacks conviction and feels really weak. It's unchallenging of the audience, which isn't Metal Gear. The series is in part so good because it goes out of its way to challenge you, to actually make you consider things rather than just giving you what you want. That's what makes these games feel authored by someone, because they're asserting something regardless of how you may respond and then standing by it. But this isn't that, it's the total opposite. It's not even an admission of a mistake or any wrongdoing, just pandering. Pandering at the expense of its own integrity. Now, the whole Rykov thing doesn't extend past this scene, so it's not a game-long problem or anything, but it's the first time the game has felt worse for how it references its constituents, and while I don't think it's explicitly representative of Kojima's views, especially now 20 years later, I do think it's genuinely regressive and kind of ugly. It doesn't even end with Volgin. After the Colonel shoots Sokolov, Snake attacks him and then tussles with the boss when she enters. Notably, they disarm each other, showing that things aren't as one-sided as they were in the beginning. But after getting the upper hand, she basically calls this guy's faggy? Go, what the fuck? I know it's the 60s, but Rykov's connection to Raiden makes this sequence simultaneously metatextual. The commentary that exists here extends beyond the limits of the game's own world, and it's so odd that that commentary is laced with pretty blatant homophobia. With Snake defenseless, Volgin exacts some revenge on the behalf of Rykov. He wakes up to darkness, hearing Volgin's torture of Sokolov, soon hearing his dead body being dragged out of the room. Then he moves on to his next victim. As he electrocutes Snake, in a reference to the torture scenes in previous titles, the Colonel hones in on the philosopher's legacy, believing that to be what Snake's ultimately after. The legacy itself isn't the money, but rather a record of those funds being extant and the location of them. As a narrative device, the Philosopher's Legacy neatly ties the three solid games and their respective central themes together, implicates gene, meme, and scene. Gene shows itself through Volgin's inheritance of the funds via his father, but also in a more symbolic way, as Metal Gear Solid 1 used the theme of gene to discuss systems of control and determinism generally. The concentration of power that the legacy allows for can then be leveraged to exert control to not just people, but across societies, cultures, countries. This feeds into meme. The things this person will be passing on is not strictly genetic, but mimetic. This legacy would then be the tapestry from which the times, scene, is weaved, moulding the geopolitical and socio-economic context of the era, which in itself would go on to have its own legacy. I think it's very pointed that these ideas have been unified and then represented by a singular object. The thing that gives someone the power to influence the world in their favour, to societally inculcate ideas and concepts across generations, exert control upon entire peoples, is capital. On one hand, giving the villain a big pile of cash to protect is part of the game's camp, but on the other, it's poignantly refined. The military-industrial complex that the previous 4 games criticized so much is complicated and intricate, but when traced back to its origin point, you simply get the interaction of war and capital, and so it makes a lot of sense to have the prequel revolve around a big check essentially, a symbol for the types of power that capital can afford people, a select few people, to exert. At the moment, Volgin's certainly cashing that check. There's a distinct lack of control here. Torture sequences prior to this are known for their interactivity. The one in MGS1 even serves as a divergent point for the plot, giving you some level of choice. But there's no player agency. You simply have to watch as Snake hangs, beaten like a piñata, by the most evil birthday boy to ever exist. This arrested control is in step with what Volgin's saying as well. Solid 1 and the Sons of Liberty use their equivalent moments as a way for villains to appear calculated and somewhat measured. Liquid, Solidus, and Ocelot still come across as out of their minds, bitter and irredeemable, but there's a level of cognitive ability on display that makes them recognizably human in at least one way. But Volgin has none of that. It's purely barbaric, wanton violence. He doesn't explain his plan, try and justify his actions with a sad backstory, or even reveal anything about Snake for some unnerving drama. His position of authority here is earned by no actual merit. It's all by way of those 3 themes: gene, meme, and scene interacting with capital. Right person, right place, right time, and willing to exploit it all. What's interesting is the interpersonal relationships and allegiances at play within the room. In previous games, there were always people with questionable loyalties. You could never quite pick who they were serving, but you knew that no matter who it was a safe assumption that they were meant to be thought of as one of the bad guys. But this time around, things are a lot murkier. Ocelot's pretty bored in, but does recoil at Volgin's excess, and is so young and will have such a history of playing both sides that you can't pin him down. The boss even more so. The shared history at play, as well as small, imprecisely motivated decisions she makes, intersect with the respect she commands to make her seem at once above all the fuckery at play, while still being very much a part of it. Then finally there's Eva, someone who Snake connects to very innately precisely because he can understand why she must lie and deceive. So you have 3 characters colluding with the enemy in different capacities while neither of them seem fully committed. When you have all these people in the same room, things get incredibly compelling. The clashing egos and murky motivations cause tensions to rise to a fever pitch during the torture. It culminates with Ocelot testing Eva with his Russian roulette shenanigans, before Snake interferes, getting his eye shot out. The boss then gives Snake one of Ocelot's single-action armies and tells him to run. There's not only the sacrifice Snake has made to keep Eva safe, but the symbolic power of what the boss does. We've seen how Snake's relationship to weapons has changed through the journey, and how taking away or giving one to him helps communicate power and his connection with someone, and this is obviously building on that. Though Snake having this weapon is also setting up for something important later. Finally, Eva quietly informs Snake of the escape route she secured and the way to get there. Post-torture, the tone has shifted somewhat. We've been made privy to the fluctuating relationships amongst your enemies and how things are possibly more tenuous than they initially seemed. The rising pressure threatens to spill over, and you suspect spill over explosively. So there's a sense of desperation within Snake, one that's represented by him being naked again, similar to the beginning of Operation Snake Eater. You have a few tools, but it feels unwise to use them much in the lion's den. The first order of business is to escape your cell, which can be done in like 5 different ways, one of which involves befriending this first version of Johnny. It's a cute scene that actually reveals to be more poignant than you'd initially expect, letting Snake wonder why he had to get caught in this mess. The lack of camo only exacerbates the gameplay tensions that existed when you first entered Gronzyj Grad, and getting down to the sewers is a short enough jaunt that the increased pressure doesn't grate on you while still impressing upon you. Once in the sewers, Eva lets you know that plans have changed, so you gotta head straight north towards the only exit that hasn't been sealed. Snake finds that the exit in question is in fact also the exit for all the water, falling many meters into a river below. Ocelot enters, and we see how more than ever there's little antagonism here. He just wants to prove that he's bested Snake. However, he's undone by his own hubris, as the gaps in blank shots allow Snake to dive off the cliff. The end of the Virtuous Mission is evoked by the fall, though this time instead of being thrown by a betrayer, he throws himself, sinking to a place of reflection by his own volition. The intensity of the setting sun provides the backdrop needed for a rather seamless transition to the burning, tree-lined river he awakes in. The rapid onset rainfall signals the arrival of the sorrow, as we saw the boss point out in the Virtuous Mission, right around when the previous fall happened. As a presence, he sort of haunts your playthrough, visible in a number of cutscenes, with Snake washing up not far from his dead body earlier. He can be helpful, but doesn't seem entirely benevolent, and that odd feeling is kinda explained and furthered here. As you wade through the water, things can feel a bit like the end of MGS2, where Raiden's naked and amongst this very oppressive environment. But there, he was between realities, unsure what to believe. Snake is between planes, more like. Not quite dead, but certainly not alive. Proof of this can be seen if you call anyone, as they repeat the lines people would say in previous games after you die. After a bit, the confrontation begins. The barely animated bodies of everyone you've killed so far will shamble by, attempting to grab you and pull them into the arms of death with them. It's a brilliant way to make you consider your actions and how that reflects on you. As guards and the Cobras pass by, it's hard not to think about what this means for Snake. How do these images coalesce with things the boss has said about who he's fighting for and what his role is? Even if you've been playing non-lethally, in which case you will only see the Cobras, there's a stark emptiness to it. It's sort of dull and lifeless. But that too acts as a point of reflection. It emphasizes how it's your job to hide away, remain unseen, and exist as an invisible hand of the state, inflicting its will wordlessly, which in itself is a dehumanizing position to have to inhabit. Additionally, by seeing only the Cobras, you only see other great soldiers, as it were, people who Snake will be compared to. And so what you see is that no matter how great, the times will create someone greater, someone more capable of violence, and you'll be displaced by them. This message comes as the boss remains the only Cobra left. Just this encounter with the Sorrow alone could act as a kernel for Big Boss's future plans for Outer Heaven and Zanzibar Land. 4 places which give people like him, like the Cobras, purpose, guarantee, and purchase within their lives. The fight here is mostly internal though. The Sorrow will occasionally do a little blast attack, as bosses are wont to do. It's at the least a reminder that you need to interact, that the fight also finds itself in a liminal state, between passivity, internality, and mechanical engagement, which forces you to externalize impulses. This dynamic is reflected by the environment. It's clearly stylized, yet resembles the... oh my god, how do you say that? What is it? Hold on.
Pony's object.
Pony's objet?
Pony's object.
Pony's objet, I guess. I'll go with one of those. It's clearly stylized, yet resembles the Pony's objet area from earlier, giving it a foot in either plane. Yeah. I mean, yeah. Let's see how that goes, eh? Once you reach the end of the river, there's another piece of this dichotomy when the Sorrow's left eye bleeds before the lens shatters, mirroring Snake's missing right eye and the gunshot that took it out. Snake then comes to underwater, desperately clawing his way onto the shore. After rising to his knees, his newfound clarity is communicated by a shot that de-emphasizes him, leaving him small and very much amongst the environment. That environment is verdant and placid, rather serene and idyllic. There's a freshness to it that we haven't felt since fighting the end, which is fitting. That fight has clarity and mutual respect within it, and only now, having had to confront what he's done, with everything taken from him, is Snake allowed to recapture that feeling. He heads up behind a waterfall deeper into the forest to meet Eva, who gives him his gear back, as well as a fresh eye patch. They fall into their usual dynamic, threatening to open up while never truly being able to do so. A butterfly flutters by, possibly symbolizing that nervousness, all the similarities and symmetry between them, though Snake, now without proper depth perception, is unable to take hold of it. He misses his chance. Eva tries to comfort him in the way that comes most naturally to her, but is pushed away, which, like the butterfly, we see from Snake's perspective. They let the fire die down and get dressed, and it's only now that we're seeing Naked Snake in his final form, so to speak, with both bandana and eye patch. It feels quite deliberate that this happens now, at a point where he's had to come to terms with facets of himself, like his role in the mission, while still able to conveniently ignore others, like the bond he shares with Eva. This rich identification with himself as a soldier and lack thereof as just a person informs who he will become, and that dichotomy is set in stone here. Eva gives you some C3 to be planted on 4 tanks around the Shagohod storage bay, which when detonated will destroy the experimental weapon. As has happened a few times now, Eva's able to lay out the road ahead and detail her objectives, which just helps get some of the expository cruft out of the way. She hops on her bike, and as they say goodbye, we see an inverse of the ending of Metal Gear Solid 1. As Solid Snake and Meryl get on the snowmobile, she asks Snake what his name is. After not saying it previously, he finally reveals it as they face the open ice and are unburdened by the mission. Yet here, as Eva sits on her bike, alone, she refuses to give her actual name, sarcastically deflecting to avoid answering, with the contrast here highlighting how their stories differ, how this one will deprive Snake of agency rather than grant it to him. Sneaking through Gronzyj Grad for the 3rd time recaptures and combines the rhythms of the first 2 instances. You have all your gear like the first time, but have to navigate the space in daylight like the second. It helps things strike a nice balance which complements the ways in which Snake has just reconciled his own character. He's able to take Gronzyj Grad on with more confidence, but kinda because he's covered himself up, not allowing himself to be vulnerable. It's also worth checking in with the survival mechanics. Although I'm a defender of them, stamina in particular really takes a back seat from Gronzyj Grad 1 and onwards. The environment simply doesn't allow for naturalistic placement of flora and fauna, and so your supplies are supplemented by ample supply stores. These tend to hold foods like rations, ramen, and calorie mates, which are really filling and don't go bad. The suspense around stamina kinda just fizzles out, unfortunately, and while it will come back with a vengeance briefly, it's not the best implementation there either. The changing gameplay dynamics has been accounted for, it's just that this type of gameplay is well tread ground by the series by now, and it isn't playing into what makes MGS3 so uniquely great. Once you're in the hangar, things improve. The Shagohod hangar really blends the 2 primary modes of gameplay through its design. It's more open like the jungle, with singular hiding places and so on, but your objective isn't to simply pass through, and so like a lot of the interiors in Snake Eater, it has a great level of continuity. You must live with your decisions and the consequences they have. This intersection of approach creates a unique tension that's fitting of the Shagohod and the way the narrative has been describing it thus far. Successfully planting the C3 feels like an accomplishment, and Snake agrees. He molds the final heart-shaped piece that Eva had given him into a butterfly. He chucks it in the air, this time catching it, in doing so proving that he's still got it, that he isn't lesser now, but at the same time the butterfly is no more once the explosive slammed into place. It's forceful, destructive, and violent, showing just what it is that Snake's been made for. Even if he derives purpose and a sense of identity from it, that doesn't make it good or less tragic. As he leaves, we see Volgin, Ocelot, and Eva before Snake's caught off guard by the boss. She disarms him again, though doesn't dismantle the gun. There's a level of mercy and leeway here that wasn't present in earlier encounters. The cracks in your enemy's alliances are really showing through now, as the boss goes to take care of Eva while whispering that she'll keep her safe, and then Ocelot briefly points a gun at Volgin. These things serve the general sentiment of feeling out of your depth, of Snake being stuck in the middle of all this stuff with little insight or concrete answers, but inevitably he can't question things for too long, as a more immediate threat always presents itself. In this case it's Volgin who takes the gloves off. Volgin will fire volleys of bullets at you, arcs of lightning, or just charge, and he can prove quite troublesome. Opportunities to do some damage can feel few and far between, with the C3's time limit only compounding on the pressure to perform. I think his challenge is sort of illusory though. If you let his AI set the tone for the encounter, where you react and wait for him, then things can get pretty dicey. But if you act aggressively, his moveset proves to be not as deadly as it may initially seem. I suppose in a way this is reflective of his character, someone who thrives off bravado and fear, the way he's perceived. But truthfully I don't think that's an intentional choice, and while he's more fun to fight than the Fury, he doesn't live up to earlier encounters like the End or the Fear. Once Volgin's taken care of, the first order of business is leaving the hangar. Upon exiting, Eva pulls up in her motorcycle with the sidecar, which Sigint references all the way back after your first encounter with her, attached. Snake climbs in and they take off. Volgin's not far behind in the Shagohod. As the tank stalks you, Eva weaves through Gronzyj Grad, having to pause to take out guards, similar to the vehicle section in MGS1. However, this iteration of the idea really overstays its welcome. It's transparently manufactured, it's very hard to actually die, and the constant scripted pauses can only be effective if you believe there's some real danger here, and there just isn't. Doing this non-lethally can be a little more fun, in that it's ridiculous. By taking out Volgin non-lethally, you're given the Cold War camo. This has the Soviet Union flag on one side and the US on the other. During the chase, facing guards with the Soviet Union side will make them stop shooting, as though they're too patriotic to damage the flag, though they'll open fire on the US side. It's really charming, but doesn't improve the section. Gameplay still feels controlled and limited. After fending off Ocelot a couple times and continuing to evade the Shagohod, you come to a rail bridge which Eva has planted some bombs on. Once on the other side, it cuts to a 30-second gameplay section where you have to just make 2 shots. It's totally unnecessary and feels like it's been put there just to reference back to MGS2 and how it had bombs planted on struts. In a complete dismissal of reality, even more so than is usual for this game, the Shagohod is shown sinking completely in the water one moment and then somehow still hanging onto the bridge the next. It seriously just doesn't make sense. Granted, Volgin just as a guy has struggled to make sense this whole game. I fuck with the choice though, as the Shagohod fight is great. It feels like a real collaboration between Eva and Snake, and is the first time that any affection between them hasn't felt subtextually artificial. It reads as finally genuine. To take it out, you must first destroy the treads with rockets, then firing at the engine in the middle to do damage. It's never as threatening or overwhelming as Rex or Ray, which is in step with the technology being utilised, but also means it's a little less intense experientially. Once the Shagohod's damaged, Volgin climbs on top and grabs the wiring, channeling the electricity through him, revving it back up. We then see Eva use herself as bait, a sort of parallel to Snake's sacrifice for her, his eye, as she's also prepared to lose something. Symbolically, the image of Volgin on top of the Shagohod like this is also important. His power is unsustainable and impossible to satiate. He'll happily cannibalize everything he's been working towards if it means feeding his own ego, and it's a good choice to evoke that in a boss fight against him. Eventually, a severe storm sweeps in and lightning strikes him. This thing, which has coursed through him, which he's used to exercise cruelty and power over others, is his undoing. Then the exposed wiring of the Shagohod creates residual sparks and shocks as he burns alive. This sudden onset inclement weather has historically been representative of the Sorrow, who recently has taken on an image of growth and reflection for Snake, and so there's a sense that what Snake was able to use to mature was enough to undo and overpower Volgin, in a way inextricably linking Snake's journey and Volgin's failure. It also shows how the fear and disgust that someone like Volgin inspires will allow his suffering to be turned into a spectacle, as he becomes a human firework, a celebration of war and its violence. At the same time, there's no one around to celebrate him, to venerate him. He just collapses in an empty patch of dirt. In this series, which will become increasingly obsessed with its own history, Volgin's legacy will be surprisingly shallow as well. His brand of evil, one that's decidedly less nuanced than others in the games, is not rewarded or honoured in any way. He's just a villain. Or was, at least. Although Volgin's out of the picture, sentries are still in pursuit, so it's time for another dull ride towards the jungle. The fixed camera angles at least provide something more cinematic and interesting to look at, I guess. But yeah, it's crazy how much the end of this game is padded out by such restrictive gameplay, when the game has excelled so much when fighting against that exact instinct. Despite Snake and Eva's best efforts, the petrol tank of the bike sprouts a leak, and the distraction it causes results in a major crash. Eva's been impaled by a branch. She tries to get Snake to leave her, but he refuses, saying that he needs her. The statement isn't as romantic as Eva initially suspects, as Snake needs her to fly the plane. Even at this desperate point, their relationship's never given room to properly flourish. Eva's knowing, pathetic sort of laugh at her own expense really spells out how she feels about it all. How no matter what she sacrifices, her position still dooms her to interpersonal emptiness. Not that a romantic relationship should be what defines her, but that as far as the narrative goes, that's what's been used to typify how the times have forsaken her. This injury doesn't really undermine her strength, as she's the one to remove herself from the branch. It's still framed as her decision. We have to be coached through some surgery again, though this time Snake's performing it on someone else. This whole sequence of the crash really exemplifies the contradictions imposed upon the relationship by the times and how it alienates both people in unique ways which will influence their futures. The camera tends to either linger or sweep around both of them during these moments, merging intimacy with drama and longing to visually communicate what's at play. Before they get going, the final thing Snake does is give Eva a single action army. Despite Ocelot's best efforts, this is the absolute most a gun has ever been loaded in this game, and none of it's literal. Weapons are power in MGS3, and we've seen how the deprivation or bestowing of them has served to build or destroy relationships, to inform us of how people interact, learn from each other. Whether it's Snake and Eva, or the boss, or Ocelot, you can track the status of these intertwined arcs by the treatment of weapons. And so when Snake needs to do something that proves his dedication and affection for Eva, but can't bring himself to actually say anything declarative, he gives her a weapon that was given to him at his lowest by his former mentor who he thought had betrayed him, a weapon who that former mentor had taken from the guy he'd come to take on a similar role for. This single-action army is imbued with symbolic power of Snake's entire journey so far. He's not just giving her a gun, but giving her a guarantee that every ounce of effort he's had to put in so far, he'll put in again to make sure she gets to the plane safely. Unfortunately, the way the player must then engage with that concept is pretty rough. You have to move through a few areas stealthily while making sure Eva doesn't die. This is where stamina clunkily barges back into the picture, as she loses it pretty fast. Eva also moves quite slowly, and you can only give 2 commands, stop or follow. This isn't so bad, and the stealth gameplay means that you tend to only move freely when you're in the clear anyway, but the problems lie in how this little section is defined in its beginning moments. After an initial screen full of some curative items and food, you move on and are given a very short amount of time before a group of guards come pouring through the same entrance you just did. If you don't know that that's going to happen as rapidly as it does, then you're pretty much guaranteed to get an alert sequence here. If that does happen, it sets a precedent for the entire section. The psychology of an alert sequence during a section where you're supposed to be protecting someone encourages you to try and evade combat as much as possible, and so you end up rushing through screens with little care, probably getting spotted again, with the issue compounding as you go. Even if you react well, it just feels bad to get ambushed what seems like unfairly, and it can really sour the whole section. You no longer trust the game design to respect the new gameplay dynamic that's being forced on you. Which is a real shame, because if you are able to evade the initial bullshit and tackle this little escort mission without the burden of an immediate alert sequence, it can be really fun. For the final bit of stealth gameplay, Snake Eater goes back to its own roots, guards in the dense jungle. But this time, your mastery of the game's systems is put on display by Eva's presence. Your food depreciates at a greater rate, and her movements are more staggered, belabored, and sudden. Each success is won in spite of the greater limitations that are upon you, and reflect on how you've improved as a player. Snake's place in the story marries up really nicely to the player's relationship with the game mechanics and level design. Things don't feel new, but undeniably different. This section can be good, it just isn't initially designed to be. In fact, if you don't fight against it for a little right away, then it proves to be some of the least fun gameplay throughout the entire experience. Soon enough, the two arrive at the lakefront, with Snake pairing off to find the boss. They come face to face in a field of swaying white flowers. The boss acknowledges her mortality, seems notably less calculated and more honest. All Snake can ask is, why? She then spends about 10 minutes telling you exactly why, giving us some of the hits of her life and beliefs. Between being secretly sent to space by the US, giving birth on the beaches of Normandy, and taking part in a mission to Cuba, we see why she felt so scorned by the American government, and more than that, the fickleness of the times and how they create enemies out of allies, and how they feed war and conflict around the world. She wants a world where the philosophers are reunited, working together again rather than in flux. What the boss covers here is an overwrought deluge of dates and events, but ultimately still serves some purpose. It creates threads between the boss and many other Metal Gear characters, allowing her to fully embody her role as the yoke from which the entire series can expand outwards from. It also, through the boss's narrative authority, gives us insight into where the writers, specifically Kojima, is coming from. Let's start off with that first. I want to explore Kojima's politics and how they're revealed here. His games use the military-industrial complex to be critical of our globalized, neoliberal capitalist world order, and in my view make criticisms that are directly informed by this politicized context. And so it's easy to then think that Kojima himself is some principled, self-identified anti-capitalist. But I think that what the boss says here is much truer to his actual outlook. It's just only now shone through, as it's the first game to take place in a time with a communist superpower. We've seen how the boss is positioned as someone above the bullshit. What she says is supposed to cut through, carry with it a sort of pure truth, one that's self-evident and legitimate. This truth is filtered through Kojima, and so I think largely represents him as well. In her speech, we see that the boss 1. Wants a world without capitalism or communism, and 2. Finds it hard to believe that Russia and the US will be enemies in the 21st century. The latter is clearly informed by the dissolution of the Soviet Union and with it the end of the Cold War, and the former speaks to Kojima's lack of actual codified ideological alliances or analyses. These two things coalesce into an apolitical naivete that makes way for the sort of blind optimism that the boss and Kojima is clinging to here. The boss's wish to see a world beyond capitalism or communism is not informed by any specific criticism of either system as differing modes of production, which is what they are. Her opposition to them is merely based on both ideologies being represented by extant states which are currently at war with each other. So what we get is a lapse in logic that can't be reconciled as it stands. The boss doesn't actually want a world without capitalism or communism, she just wants a world without war. Kojima feels politically much the same. He's someone who can craft a compelling critique of a moment in time, whether that time is contemporaneous or not. But I get the impression that if you asked him, he wouldn't really be able to formulate a definition of capitalism or communism that's based on any sort of cogent theory. This missing fundamental bedrock for analysis germinates into teleological liberalism, a belief that the world trends towards improvement, and as such the emergence and ascent of liberalism is necessarily a good thing and something that must be preserved. This outlook creates space for the optimism that emerges at the end of each of his games. By the end of MGS 1 and 2, nothing structurally has changed, there's no reason to believe that their world will improve, and yet they veer into character-driven optimism in spite of themselves, kinda out of obligation it feels like. Kojima's politics mean that by the end of one of his stories, things should appear good, even if for no good reason. And the boss's speech here sort of reveals a similar inclination, though we'll soon see if the trend continues in that regard. Now, none of this is me trying to say that I'm like smarter than Kojima or anything, and it doesn't discount the good points he does make. I mean, hopefully the multiple hours I've spent analysing these games out of my love for them demonstrates that. I just think it's interesting to look at how a work can reveal someone, make you see them in a more complete, honest light. Like I said, Kojima's games are incredibly critical of capitalism, but despite the specificity and validity of those critiques, they themselves are sculpted by the times. Once you turn the clock back a few decades, we see that Kojima has no fundamental basis from which his critiques are formed. They merely spring out of his own experiences and circumstances. In the capitalist hegemony of the mid-1990s to early 2010s, Kojima's commentary holds up as it all exists under the rule of one ideological strain, but in the 1960s he's having to contend with conflicting ideologies, and we see that his ultimate statement regarding that conflict isn't informed by an actual structural understanding of them. I do think this shows a lack of intellectual rigor that makes way for some thematic messiness and incongruity, but it's nonetheless interesting. In my Metal Gear 1 and 2 video, I identified Kojima as someone obsessed with imagery and symbols. His games are full of reoccurring ideas, some which span 12 hours, like the way weapons are treated in this game, and some which span decades, like a de-emphasizing of violence and how it manifests visually, from Metal Gear in 1987 to Death Stranding in 2019. And I think approaching what the boss says here from that angle helps illuminate its purpose. The Berlin Wall falling is a historically canonized image, and so it's leveraged symbolically here through the use of stock footage, even if its presence highlights gaps in the boss's and by extension Kojima's ultimate point. This monologue is pretty revealing of Kojima, someone who, despite literally putting himself in his games, can in interviews and such feel resistant to legitimately reflecting on his work and how it represents him. And to finally get around to the other point of this speech, it does much the same for the boss. Her exploitation doesn't just connect her to Snake, but also his genetic legacy, and people that Solid Snake will come into contact with, like Otacon and Grey Fox. We also hear that the boss's child was stolen from her, much like Olga's in MGS2, and she explains how the philosophers became the formless amalgam that the Patriots are by the Sons of Liberty. The boss is this monument to betrayal, a tortured membrane that connects all of Metal Gear's ideas together, the material from which its web is spun. I suppose I haven't addressed how it's a bit silly that she's just called the boss, but it's fully justified here, as this encounter then becomes the boss fight. It's definitive, final, and positioned as the origin point from which all conflicts henceforth spring from, and that weight is felt. Thanks to the speech, you fully understand how everything from Metal Gear 1 to Metal Gear Solid 2 is connected to the boss, and soon, Big Boss. All your actions have been retroactively recontextualized in a way that doesn't feel cheap. It's earned. So, for the fight itself. The arena is very appropriate. You can find 3 different snakes in the surrounding trees, one each for Solid, Solidus, and Liquid. This is calling back to and paying off the foreshadowing of when we first saw the boss in Operation Snake Eater. Back then there was a single snake draped over a branch, setting up Naked Snake as the disciple of the boss. But now, as Snake's primed to supplant the role of boss by overcoming the boss, we see the people who will become his disciples. Not mimetic ones, but genetic ones through laissez-faire Tarib. The white flowers evoke the boss's suit, with the green leaves and stems matching Snake. It's a fantastic stylized image that befits the drama, with plumes of petals following the boss's footsteps. You see those plumes right away as she races towards you. The boss will often try to engage you in CQC, creating moments reminiscent of most of your encounters with her so far, where she overpowers Snake in hand-to-hand combat. She'll also attack from range with the custom Patriot which she previously used to try and give Snake an out, a chance to leave this all behind. Naturally, your best counter to this is to get on the floor and hide, peeking out with a sniper to take shots here and there. Or at least that's what I do. It manages to recreate normal gameplay within a very heightened context. The fight with the End did this same thing by exacerbating the systems of the game, stretching it across 4 screens and requiring deeper mechanical engagement. The boss fight takes a different tact to capture a similar effect, intensifying the dramatic elements to make what are by now rather banal interactions feel valuable and powerful. You're not just hiding from another enemy, you're hiding from the enemy, using her own moves against her. Interestingly, this is pretty much the only point in the game where the snow camouflage is most effective. Visually, Snake must mimic the battlefield itself, embodying not just his role as a soldier of war, but specifically how that retains part of himself through the green while embracing the boss through the presence of the white. He inherits the symbolic weight of the arena. As the struggle wages on, time is ticking. You have 10 minutes before bombs are dropped on the area, and at about minute 5, Snake Eater starts playing. The lifespan of this song is pretty storied. It's first used as a dedication to tone, and more specifically the brand of camp being used. It's bombastic and overwhelming, more representative of what we think we're in for, but then a sparing version is used during the ladder climb and the talk with Eva in the cave. Its use in those moments punctuates being brought back to reality, Snake being grounded and growing as a person. And then finally, it's here in his encounter with the person most responsible for his growth, bestowing the boss with some additional power, while the lyrics still honour what we've done as Snake, sneak around, survive off the environment. It's almost playing the boss off and signalling that Snake will inherit that title. After enough time you prevail and the boss lays in the dirt without her usual composure, she hands Snake a data film containing the location of the philosopher's legacy. She also hands over the Patriot which Snake will use to kill her. For probably the first time in the game, we see a shot from the boss's perspective, looking up at Snake as he looks back with the Patriot pointed right at the camera. We're then removed from either of them, overlooking the scene yet put in control of Snake, and the gun won't fire until you make it. It's this odd but powerful acknowledgement that you have control but will never be these people. They have their own stories and a right to own them. The boss's blood radiates out to the flowers in the field and we see the pale horse once again. I posited that it symbolized conquest and death earlier. In killing the boss, Snake has furthered both. Death is obvious, but by doing his government's bidding, he's aided in their goals, which themselves are primarily motivated by conquest. The boss's C-section scar, which is meant to mimic a snake, slithers off her body and into the real world. Although her child had been stolen, Snake took its place. However, he's moved beyond that title, supplanting her role, thereby making the scar redundant. In fulfilling the death that the boss has been waiting for, he's alleviated her burden. She can be pure again in a way. Not that a C-section scar is necessarily impure. The music that plays during this is more choral than the rest of the soundtrack. It feels reminiscent of the vocals from when Solid Snake is sneaking into Shadow Moses at the beginning of MGS1. I think there's a purposeful connection here, bridging the historical gap and reaching at the consequences that this fight will have for Naked Snake. In connecting this fight to Solid Snake, it also highlights the parallels between Naked Snake fighting the boss and Solid Snake's encounter with Big Boss in Metal Gear 2. Eva and Snake hop in the wig and begin to take off. Soon enough an engine blows out thanks to Ocelot, who's pursuing them on a hover platform thing, which, they just exist. He then boards the wig as they struggle to regain altitude. Him and Snake have a little wrestle, and there's a great moment where Ocelot tries to jab Snake in his now non-existent right eye. He just smirks as he feels nothing. On its face it's goofy, but communicates something larger, that this wound, as a symbol of the mission, can be something which he benefits from, that the time he's spent here has had value. As Ocelot raises to fire his gun at Snake, everything comes back around. Eva throws Snake the single-action army that he gave her, reflecting not just the guarantee it represents, but calling back to her giving him a weapon earlier, the silenced Trank. Their collaboration on this mission is punctuated either side by this act of handing him a pistol, with this final one being loaded with the history and relationships of the entire mission. Ocelot pulls the bullet from round his neck off one last time and loads it into his gun. He juggles the 2 pistols and lays them on the ground. Sort of like the bridge section, this is an important moment that just isn't translated very well mechanically. The cutscene ends, there's a couple second transition, you slowly walk over to choose a gun, there's another transition, the 2 walk their paces, turn around and draw, there's a few second transition, and then you just mash fire hoping you have the bullet in your gun, which, considering Ocelot put the guns behind his back at the last second earlier, you can't actually know which one is the right choice. Then, depending on if you chose correctly, either Snake refuses to fire at Ocelot or Ocelot fires but it's a blank. Ocelot says until next time and just fucking jumps off the plane. On some level this makes sense. Ocelot and Snake can't die, of course, continuity doesn't allow it, and there is symbolic weight to this relationship ending on this note, with the bullet around the neck, the single action army and the blank eye prod. But in the end all the tension just dissipates during this laborious and brain-dead process. The player interaction is negligible to the point of being needless, and it doesn't say much new, really just reiterates how these two have been interacting for over half the game now. It feels like an obligation, like the writers felt they needed one last direct interaction between these two, though in practice it's limp and despite its efforts, unceremonious. Even with Ocelot's lost weight, the Wig struggles to gain altitude, but with their combined strength, Eva and Snake can pull up enough to make it out of the lake and up into the air. They share a laugh, but it's short-lived as some Russian jets catch up to them. The existential threat allows Snake to show some legitimate vulnerability to Eva, though seconds later the boss's death is reported to Khrushchev, thereby clearing the US's name for the initial Davy Crockett explosion. The jets are called off and the pair can fly to safety. They celebrate in a cabin in Alaska. Snake drops the facade momentarily to ask Eva about her future, but she doesn't budge. They embrace, and it's the first time things are untethered from obligation, from looming danger. This is reflected in the wine glasses being tipped over onto the carpet. Its visual similarity to blood highlights the contrast of the moment. They aren't cleaning up wounds to survive, but carelessly spilling wine, a symbol of indulgence so that they can embrace. Then there's the goofy yet great shot of them splayed out on the floor, mimicking this tiger skin rug next to them, not so subtly evoking the animalistic desire they have for each other. Snake wakes up alone and we hear a message from Eva play where she finally tells the truth. After growing up and training in a transnational philosophers run facility, she became a spy for China, acting in this mission as a KGB spy to trick Volgan and Snake. Her mission was similar to ours, get the Shagohod test data and the legacy film. She was instructed to kill anyone who knew the truth, but she couldn't bring herself to kill Snake, feeling she owed it to the boss, who sniffed her out immediately, soon telling Eva everything as well. There's a lot more to this monologue than just some plot twists though. We see that Eva's left the photo she took earlier in the cave for Snake, where he's reaching out. Earlier, Snake was able to redeem himself with the C3 after missing the butterfly in this same cave, but his success is subverted here, as he's unable to keep a hold of Eva. As she explains that her mission would mean killing Snake, we see a callback to him killing the boss. Eva stands over his body with a gun pointed at him. With the boss, it cuts away to a wide to remind us of the agency each of them have in regards to their own stories. This time when it cuts wide, some temporal flexibility is leveraged, with Snake still sat down listening to the tape. By making him occupy a space outside the moment, thereby sharing it with the player and their perspective, the game can communicate how his agency is being taken away. Then at the end, we see the game begin to engage in the now familiar optimism from MGS1 and 2 I talked about earlier. Eva opines about just living your life, like Snake at the end of both previous games, before riding off into the sun like in MGS1. However, with the message over, the tape bursts into flames, hinting that maybe the forced idealism won't be honoured this time around. What helps piece this whole thing together is what Eva says right at the beginning of it. The trifecta of Adam, Eve and Snake is brought back around, as this time Eva, was able to tempt Snake and obtain the forbidden fruit. Initially this comes across rather clumsy and overstated. This interpretation of the relationship is obvious from the beginning, and so outright stating it here is just not needed. But beyond that, I think resurfacing this aspect from subtext to text at this moment helps raise some important points. In his book A Brief History of Misogyny, Jack Holland begins at creation myths like those of Prometheus or Original Sin. He highlights how in these instances women are treated as ultimately accursed, foisted upon men to tempt and corrupt them. He posits that this characterization informs a lot of the patriarchal thinking of societies which believe these stories. So as a final send-off to Eva and her glorious role as the first well-written woman in a Kojima game, she's able to subvert the story of Original Sin. Now within the text, Eva's still tempting and then tricking a man, but I feel that by invoking Original Sin, the game acknowledges the circumstances or times at play. Eva's doing what she must to get ahead in a game stacked against her, and subverting the foundational story of Christianity to say that is actually pretty cool. On top of this, by bringing myths and stories to the forefront again, Snake Eater prepares us for this ending. What we're seeing happen here is myth making, the true transformation from naked snake, war hero, into big boss, legendary soldier. As Snake receives accolades and applause for his accomplishment, Eva reveals the truth about the mission. The boss's defection was arranged by the US government, so she could ingratiate herself with Vulcan and find out where the philosopher's legacy was. However, when he fired the Davy Crockett, the US became suspicious, and so Snake was sent in to kill the boss to clear the government's name. During the private ceremony, Snake's pointedly stoic and incredulous. It makes you realize how much he really had opened up. In Metal Gear 1 and 2, Big Boss's purported goal is to create a world where soldiers have a purpose, as they belong on the battlefield, and this cutscene reflects that reality, at least within Naked Snake. After all the sneaking and violence, he looks most uncomfortable here under flashing lights and grateful politicians. The scene inside the office feels tethered to Big Boss's lethargy. The camera is rather restrained. It still moves around the room, but there's little urgency, as though being away from war is actively slowing Snake down. As he departs, the main melody from the Metal Gear Solid 2 theme, which is reused in this game's theme, plays. These moments are being sonically tied to everything that happens between now and the Big Shell incident in Sons of Liberty. The connection is being drawn as the boss's victimhood to the times is fully hammered home. In a world split in two, she will be thought of with revulsion on both sides, doomed by the government she sacrificed her life to absolve. As Snake approaches her grave, you see how unremarkable it is, indistinguishable from the rest. The game's fully bought into its own continuity by now, but this shot divests from that momentarily. It shows that the boss's sacrifice was not necessarily a unique one. Perhaps all these other people laid here suffered similar fates, showing that the forces which forsake her are larger than just this story. The final thing we see is Snake saluting, a tear falling from his only remaining eye, emphasizing his own sacrifice and what it now represents. Not just his history with Eva, but also the forces that led to that situation, the gun that shot it out and the legacy that invokes. The story you've just experienced is etched into his face, and he's stopped being a man. He is now the myth. After a quick rundown of preceding events like the formation of Foxhound by Big Boss, the disappearance of Eva, and the name change from Philosophers to Patriots, followed by the credits, we get the classic Ocelot twist-a-thon. First he's on the phone to the Soviets, saying that they have the US in the palm of their hands after the whole affair. He then hangs up and begins to chat to the Americans, saying that they have the legacy, as the one Eva got was a fake. He finally reveals that he was Adam, who Snake was meant to meet at the factory. For such a loaded game, Metal Gear Solid 3 winds up ending rather neatly in its own messy, dramatic way. The sordid details all coalesce, tying the thematic threads together so that they can stretch seamlessly to the events of Metal Gear 1. The way Snake and Eva's relationship burns out, leaving Snake open for the crushing truth behind his mission, and the ironic heaping of praise that follows it is amazing. It's this deluge of cruelty heaped onto someone who thought the worst was over. And that cruelty is what's needed to embitter Naked Snake, which then allows the game to cap itself off, to properly set up how Snake could become Big Boss. It makes sense that he conceives of his relationship with the boss through the lens of the battlefield, and so in trying to preserve her legacy, he wants to create a world with endless battlefields. It's still an absurd goal, but one built out of a level of betrayal and deception so grand that it borders on self-parody, thereby making the goal not quite as absurd in contrast. It's like every bad thing that came out of MGS3 was just concentrated into a single beam attack on Snake, like everyone agreed they were just gonna fuck this one guy and his warm arm over. In saying this, it's important to acknowledge the timeline again. Big Boss doesn't start out of heaven the day after laying the Patriot down at the boss's grave. There's a 20-odd year gap that the player can fill in themselves, extrapolate and justify in their own way so that everything's squared away in their head. In terms of the ending, I'd say that the post-credits Ocelot reveals are the only thing I'm not enthusiastic about, though I don't hate them. My ambivalence is really the problem. What he says doesn't really change much, it's just him butting in again to remind us he's messy for the sake of tradition, and it sort of deflates the high drama of the ending. It's further proof that Ocelot as a character sort of runs his course through the first 2/3 of the game. He doesn't develop any further from that point, just showing up now and then to do Ocelot type shit, then overstaying his welcome during the 4 different endgame sections Snake Eater has. But that's one of the few criticisms I have of Metal Gear Solid 3. MGS3 finds safety in both the prequel and the familiar PlayStation 2 hardware. This doesn't allow for complacency, but rather reflection, introspection. It looks back upon not just the series as a whole, but Kojima's outlook and the world that influenced it. In this way, it manages to remain subversive and thoughtful in a very reactionary time. The contrast at play is smoothed out by a further investment into camp and genre. Thematic flourishes are embedded in nonsensical character moments, obvious, gaudy choices belie the more complicated commentary below the surface, and everything always remains fun, or at the least engaging. The cast has been created with a keen sense of Metal Gear's history, while breaking new ground by not seeing women as just sexual objects. They can be maternal figures too. Yeah, things aren't perfect, but they are better, and reveal how Metal Gear looks back on its past in interesting ways. It does the same with gameplay. The systems and mechanics are incredibly indebted to the past, but have been expanded upon and situated within a genius structure and matrix of game design to truly shine. It doesn't just empower the player to really play, but to think about what your play says. Gameplay asks you to take risks, to make sacrifices, to balance your resources and your humanity. All those things play into the times, into the fragility of war, of the definition of enemy, and so every step you choose to take carries narrative weight. Hideo Kojima isn't solely responsible for this game, of course, but he does feel like the thread that ties it together. And what he does here is connect his current self to his childhood self, examines how one can become the other, similar to Naked Snake becoming Big Boss, and to how the Cold War and the US's ensuing dominance would allow the war on terror to flourish, to successfully slaughter millions for profit. Metal Gear Solid 3 is refined and considered, but also unafraid and curious. From the first time I played it to now, I've always been enamored with its completeness, something that very few other games capture. Not because it closes a loop, but precisely because it's dramatically, thematically more potent to not do that. Snake Eater is perfect because it refuses to be. It gets 95% of the way there and lets the player bring the other 5%. That's not a deal I'll ever be able to turn down. Oh my god, I just realized I didn't even talk about the music that much. How the fuck did I go over 2 hours and manage to skip that? Harry, I'm sorry dude, I really should have gone over that.